A man with no title, no name tag, no reason to be feared. But when the guns came out, he was the only one they should have been afraid of. The ballroom was full of the most powerful people in the city: billionaires, politicians, philanthropists in diamonds and designer suits. And somewhere in that glittering crowd stood a single father in a rented tuxedo, watching his daughter sneak a third chocolate truffle off a passing tray. Nobody looked at him twice. That was about to become the most catastrophic mistake of the evening. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Harrington Grand Hotel had spent 3 weeks transforming its main ballroom into something that looked less like a charity event and more like a fever dream about old money. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from a vaulted ceiling painted with murals that nobody at the party had time to look at. The tables were draped in ivory linen so precisely pressed that the creases could have been measured with a ruler. Each centerpiece, an arrangement of white orchids and pale green eucalyptus stems, had cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills. A string quartet played in the far corner near the bar, and their music drifted through the room like something polite and forgettable, the kind of sound designed to fill silence without demanding attention. It was the kind of place that made Logan Pierce quietly, privately uncomfortable. Not because it was beautiful. Beauty didn't bother him. It was the performance of it all. The way the men shook hands with both palms, the way the women laughed at exactly the right moments, the way everyone wore their wealth like a second skin so practiced they'd stopped noticing it. Logan noticed it. He always noticed things he didn't belong to. He stood near the east edge of the room, close to one of the tall windows that overlooked the hotel's private garden, holding a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His tuxedo was rented from a place on Mercer Street that did dry cleaning and formal wear for people who needed formal wear exactly once or twice a year. It fit well enough across the shoulders, though the jacket was a half size too long in the sleeves, and he'd had to watch a YouTube tutorial to get the bow tie right. He was 37 years old. He had a small scar running along his left jawline from a training accident in Coronado, California, that had happened when he was 23. His hands were large and calloused in a way that didn't match the tuxedo. His eyes were the kind of brown that looked almost black in low light, and he had the habit, the deeply ingrained automatic habit, of never quite letting his gaze rest in one place for too long. His daughter, Maisie, had found him in that habit and given it a name. "You're doing the thing again," she'd told him once, when she was 7, watching him scan a McDonald's dining room before they sat down. "The looking thing." What looking thing? Where you look at all the doors. He hadn't known what to say to that. So he'd said, "I just like to know where things are." And she'd accepted it with the particular exhausted patience of a child who had decided that her father was mildly strange but fundamentally harmless. She was 9 now, and she was currently standing 12 feet away from him at a dessert table, attempting to engineer a situation in which a fourth chocolate truffle would somehow appear in her hand without him seeing her take it. He watched her. He was always watching her. Not with the same tactical scan he used on rooms. That was different. That was threat assessment. That was years of training that didn't have an off switch. But with something that had no official name, the specific attentiveness of a parent who had been solely responsible for another human being's entire existence for 9 years without backup. Maisie Pierce was small for her age, with dark curly hair she refused to have cut because she'd decided she was growing it out to her waist, a goal she'd held consistently for 14 months. She was wearing a navy blue dress that they'd found on clearance at a department store 2 weeks ago, and she'd paired it with white tights and the same patent leather shoes she wore to school picture day. She looked, Logan thought, absolutely perfect. She also looked like she was currently attempting to use a nearby woman's large handbag as visual cover while reaching toward the truffle plate. "Maisie," she froze. "I can see you." She straightened up, turned, and gave him a look of profound innocence that he did not believe for a single second. "I was just looking at the chocolate ones. You've had 3. They're small. They're also not why we're here." She walked back toward him with the deliberate, dignified pace of someone who had decided that retreat was not defeat, but strategic repositioning. She stopped at his elbow and looked around the ballroom with the frank, unsentimental assessment of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend to be impressed by things. "Why are we here?" she asked. It was a reasonable question. They were there because his friend Danny Kowalski, who did contracting work for the Langford Foundation, had offered Logan 2 tickets to the gala as payment for helping him move a storage unit full of audio-visual equipment the previous weekend. Danny had framed it as a favor. "Come on, man, it's a free dinner and they're doing a whole thing about the Veterans Scholarship Program. I thought you'd want to see it." And Logan had said yes, mostly because Maisie had never been to anything like this, and he'd thought, in a vague and unexamined way, that it might be good for her to see something different. He hadn't thought it through much further than that. "We're here for the foundation event," he told her. "The Veterans Scholarship Program." "Are you going to get a scholarship?" "No, I'm going to watch other people get scholarships." "Is that fun?" "It's important." She considered this. "Those are different things," she said. "Yeah," he said. "They are." She leaned against his arm, which was a thing she still did, casually and without ceremony, as though it were simply a convenient surface, and he let her, and they stood like that for a moment in the middle of all that manufactured elegance, quiet and slightly out of place, and not particularly bothered by it. Across the room, on the far side of the dance floor, he could see Celeste Langford. He'd seen her on the news a few times, on magazine covers in the waiting room at his daughter's pediatrician, in the kind of headlines that aggregated online in the morning when you were trying to read the weather. She was hard to miss, not because she was particularly loud or dramatic, but because she had that quality that some people had, the quality of occupying a room in a way that made the room reorganize itself subtly around her. She was 30 years old, founder and CEO of Langford Technologies, which had spent the last 4 years doing things in clean energy infrastructure and data security that Logan didn't fully understand but had read enough about to know were significant. She was worth somewhere in the region of $6 billion, which was a number so large it had stopped meaning anything to Logan around the 5th time he'd read it. She was wearing a deep green gown, standing near the stage talking to 2 men in suits who were nodding at everything she said with the slightly overeager attentiveness of people who needed something from her. Her dark hair was pulled back. She was laughing at something one of them said, but the laugh was the polite kind, the performance kind. And Logan, who spent a lot of his time watching people because watching people was simply what he did, could see the precise distance she'd put between herself and the conversation. She was working the room the way you work when you've done it enough times that your body does it, while your mind is somewhere else. He looked away. His water glass was still full. He should probably eat something. The dinner service had been, he checked his watch, about 40 minutes ago, and the table they'd been assigned to had been pleasant enough, with a retired school principal named Howard and his wife Margaret, who had asked Maisie approximately 14 questions about school and then listened to every single answer with the focused interest of people who genuinely liked children. Logan had eaten half his salmon and 3 of Maisie's green beans when she wasn't looking. He was scanning the room for a waiter who might be carrying something less formal than a dessert tray when he noticed the first one. It was nothing at first, just a man near the main entrance, a big man in a dark jacket who had been standing in roughly the same position for the last 9 minutes and had not done the things that staff usually did, checking phones, adjusting earpieces, making small adjustments to the things around them. He was just standing. His jacket sat wrong across the chest. Logan's eyes moved on without pausing, the way they always did, but the information filed itself quietly somewhere useful. Then he saw the second one, near the service corridor on the north wall. Another big man, different jacket, same quality of stillness. And then the third, positioned near the stage entrance behind the curtain, visible only because Logan was standing at an angle that let him see the gap in the fabric. He felt something drop through the center of his chest, cold and familiar and deeply unwelcome. "Maisie," he said. His voice was the same. He kept it the same. "Come stand next to me." She shifted to stand directly at his side, sensing something in his voice, even if she couldn't name it. "What's wrong?" "Nothing yet," he said. "Just stay with me." He counted them, one by the main doors, one by the service corridor, one behind the stage. He turned his head slowly, incrementally, doing the kind of survey that looked like nothing from the outside. Just a man turning slightly to say something to his daughter. Just a man glancing at a chandelier. Just a man checking his watch. 3 more by the emergency exits on the east wall. And the man near the bar who'd been nursing the same drink for 20 minutes and hadn't made eye contact with a single person and whose left hand hadn't left his jacket pocket. 7 that he could confirm. Probably more that he couldn't. The string quartet was still playing. The conversations around him were still flowing, easy and disconnected from everything. Howard and Margaret were probably still at their table. Maisie was pressing slightly against his arm, not quite leaning, but close enough that he could feel her warmth. He had started running calculations before he consciously decided to. Entry points. The main ballroom entrance, sealed. Service corridor covered. 3 emergency exits all covered. Windows, 12 feet off the floor, overlooking a garden 2 stories down, not viable for the crowd. Stage area. 1 additional exit behind the curtains that he hadn't confirmed but suspected existed based on the layout of the building. Number of hostiles, 7 confirmed, estimated 2 to 3 additional unconfirmed. Civilian count approximately 240, give or take, scattered across the room with the highest concentration near the stage, where they were expecting remarks from Celeste Langford in, he checked the event program someone had handed him at the door, 11 minutes. He was still doing the math when the lights went out. Not all the way. The main chandeliers died with a noise that wasn't quite a pop and wasn't quite a hum. And for 3 full seconds the room went dark except for the ambient glow coming through the windows from the city outside and the pale blue emergency strips along the floor. The string quartet stopped. The conversations cut off the way conversations do when something frightening happens. Not gradually, but all at once, like a switch. And then the emergency lights came on, flooding the room in that unflattering red-white color that makes everything look like a disaster film, and the men in dark jackets came through every entrance simultaneously. They moved fast. Professionals. Not amateurs playing at this, but people who had drilled it, who knew where to go and how many steps it took and what to do if someone ran. 3 of them had submachine guns. 2 had handguns. The ones Logan hadn't fully confirmed came in through the service corridor carrying rifles that they'd had concealed in equipment cases, which explained the AV equipment that had been rolling through the hotel's service entrance for the past 2 hours. He had 1 second to think, I should have noticed the cases. Then the first shout cut through the room. Nobody moves! Stay where you are! The screaming started. It always started, no matter how many times you'd seen it, no matter how trained you were, because the human body heard a gun and a shout in a crowded room, and it made a decision at the cellular level that was older than language. Women grabbed their partners. Men froze or dove or stumbled backward. A glass shattered somewhere. A chair went over. Logan did not move. He put his left hand on Maisie's shoulder, firmly, not roughly, and he stepped slightly in front of her, which put his body between her and the nearest armed man. His right hand dropped to his side. His breathing slowed, not because he'd told it to, but because that was what happened when the training came back. The volume on everything else went down. The screaming around him became background noise. The calculations he'd already started running sharpened into focus. Get down on the floor, all of you, on the floor, hands where we can see them. People around him were dropping. Logan lowered himself to one knee, then the other, pulling Maisie down with him, keeping her in front of him with his body curving slightly around her like a parenthesis. He kept his head down, but his eyes up. He was counting, updating, repositioning the confirmed locations of each operative as they spread through the room. Daddy, Maisie whispered. Her voice was very small and very steady, which was somehow harder to hear than crying would have been. I'm right here, he said quietly. I've got you. Don't look at them. Look at me. She looked at him. She was 9 years old and she had her mother's eyes, though her mother had been gone for 6 years now, and Logan had spent every one of those 6 years being both things at once, the shield and the home, the discipline and the warmth, the one who fixed the broken things, and also the one who sat on the floor outside her bedroom door at 2 a.m. when she had nightmares and didn't know what to say but stayed anyway. He had been a Navy SEAL. He had been in firefights in places whose names he didn't say out loud. He had done things that had been necessary and had cost him pieces of himself that he'd never fully recovered. And then Sarah had died and Maisie was 3, and there had been nothing left to do except come home and be her father. He looked at his daughter. He kept his face calm. He kept his voice steady. Look at me, he said again. Just right here. She nodded. He turned his attention back to the room. The lead operative had moved to the center of the floor. Logan assessed him quickly. 6'2", maybe 6'3", built like someone who used his body professionally and had done so for years. The way he moved wasn't theatrical or performative. He moved with an economy that Logan recognized, the kind of movement that meant the man wasn't acting dangerous, he simply was dangerous. He wore no mask. That was significant. People who wore no masks either didn't care about being identified or had no intention of leaving witnesses behind. Either option was bad. "My name is not important," the man said. He had an accent that Logan couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe, something from the region between formal and clipped. His voice was controlled, carrying across the room without needing to be raised. "What is important is that you understand the following." He raised one hand. Two operatives moved toward the stage. Two more positioned themselves at the corners of the room covering the exits. The remaining ones, Logan counted 3 still mobile, began moving through the crowd, pulling people's phones, dropping them into a metal-lined bag that would suppress any signal. Signal jamming too, Logan noted, which explained why nobody had heard anyone outside try to call in. The hotel's regular comms would be dead. "We are here for one person," the lead man said. "For everyone else, this is simply a matter of patience. You sit quietly, you cause no problems, and in 4 hours you will go home to your families. This is a business matter. It does not need to become anything else." The phones were being collected methodically, table by table. Logan slowly turned his right hand palm down on the floor, pressed it flat, felt the ballroom's cold marble under his fingers. He identified the nearest hostel, 12 feet to his left, working through the crowd toward their section, and began to think about angles. Then the lead man's voice changed, not dramatically, not in a way most people in that room would have noticed, but Logan caught it, the slight compression, the half-breath pause before the next sentence, the way a person sounds when they move from script to something they've been anticipating. "Ms. Langford," the man said, "please stand up." Silence. "Ms. Celeste Langford, I know you're in this room. I've been watching you for the past 3 hours. Please stand up now, or I will have my associates begin encouraging compliance in ways I suspect nobody here will enjoy." The pause that followed lasted roughly 4 seconds and felt like much longer. Logan had turned his head 45 degrees and could see across the ballroom to where Celeste Langford had been standing. She was on the floor like everyone else, in her green dress, with her arms wrapped around her own knees and her head up. Not down, not buried, but up, watching the man in the center of the room with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite defiance, but was something positioned uncomfortably between the two. She stood up. There was a sound in the room, collective and involuntary, the breath of 240 people all doing the same thing at once. "Thank you," the lead man said. He almost sounded like he meant it. 2 operatives moved to flank her. She stood perfectly still as they approached, and Logan watched her hands, at her sides, not raised, not reaching, just at her sides, and noted that she was doing the things smart people did in dangerous situations. She was not making herself smaller, but she was also not making herself a problem. She was reading the room and buying time. She was smarter than most people gave her credit for, Logan thought. Though most people who put her on magazine covers probably thought the same thing for different reasons. The lead operative approached her directly. They were the same height, which seemed to momentarily confuse him in some minor way that he covered quickly. "We're going to take a short walk," he told her. "You're going to come with us. And then we're going to have a conversation about certain proprietary files that your company's research division has been developing for the past 18 months. "Those files don't exist," she said. Her voice was clear. Not shaking, Logan noticed. Maybe a controlled tremor that she was managing that he couldn't tell from this distance, but the words themselves were delivered clean. The lead man looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and gave a small hand signal to the operative on his right. That operative walked to the nearest table, reached down, and pulled a man off the floor by the back of his jacket. An older man, maybe 60, in a gray suit, who made a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a shout. The operative held him at arm's length and pressed the barrel of his handgun against the man's temple. The room erupted, not in action. Nobody moved. Nobody was stupid enough to move, but in noise, in the kind of noise that crowds make when something crosses from threat into reality, when the abstract suddenly has weight and temperature and the smell of gun oil. They exist, the lead man said to Celeste, as if none of that had happened. Her jaw was tight. Logan could see it from 20 feet away. They exist, the man repeated. And you will give us access, or we will begin demonstrating that we have no particular interest in whether everyone in this room goes home tonight. Logan lowered his eyes to the floor. He kept his breathing slow. He kept his hands flat on the cold marble. He needed to think. He needed to count and map and think. He had no weapon. He had a rented tuxedo and a bow tie he'd learned to knot from a YouTube video, and his daughter was pressed against his right side with her face turned slightly into his jacket, and her fingers wrapped around his sleeves so tightly that he could feel the pressure of each one individually. He had no backup. He had no communications. He had 7, now confirmed 8. He'd spotted the one near the kitchen doors who'd come in late, armed men who had planned this meticulously, who had jammed signals and covered exits and timed their entrance to the moment the event program put 240 people in the same room with nowhere to go. He had no good options. He assessed this with the same flat clarity he'd once applied to situations in very different rooms in very different countries, and arrived at the same conclusion he'd arrived at in every one of those situations. There are no good options, only options that are worse than other options, and the question is never whether to act, but only when. When and how, and in what order. He looked at Maisie. She was looking at him. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't cried. Not yet. And her chin was doing the thing children's chins do when they're holding something back through pure effort. She looked like she was waiting. She had always been, in her small and unassuming way, very good at waiting for him to tell her what to do, and very good at doing it without question when he did. He had promised her 3 months after her mother died, when she was 3.5 and still not entirely sure what death meant, only that Mommy hadn't come back. He had sat on the edge of her bed with its purple sheets and the stuffed elephant she called Gerald, and he had said very quietly, "I will always come back. That is the one thing I will always do. I will always come back." He had kept that promise through things she would never know about, and in places she would never see, and at costs he'd never let her total up. And he intended to keep it tonight. He needed 30 seconds with the operative who was closest to him. He needed those 30 seconds to look like nothing. He needed Maisie somewhere safe first. He turned his head. 12 feet to his left, mostly behind the cover of a toppled chair, and the tablecloth of the nearest table draped to the floor, was a gap in the room's furniture layout large enough for a small person to curl into and not be immediately visible from 4 of the 8 hostile positions. He knew this because he had been mapping it for the past 9 minutes, and he was certain because he did not guess at these things. Not anymore. Not since the day in Fallujah when a guess had cost him 3 hours on a rooftop that he still didn't like thinking about. He turned his head toward his daughter. "Maisie," he said, barely a sound, barely a breath, "do you see the gap behind that chair? The big chair with the gold back tipped over." She looked. A small movement of her eyes. She nodded. "When I tell you, I need you to crawl there, slowly. Don't stand up. Just crawl, keep low, and curl up behind the tablecloth. Can you do that?" She looked at him. Her chin was still doing the thing. "Where are you going?" "I need to do something," he said. "I'll be right back." "You promise?" "I promise." She held his gaze for a moment with the specific, terrible, assessing look that children give adults when they are deciding whether the adult is telling the truth or doing the thing adults did when they protected you by not being honest. She was 9. She was old enough to know the difference. "Okay," she said. "Not yet," he said. "Wait for me." He turned back to the room. The lead operative had moved Celeste 3 steps toward the stage. The man in the gray suit had been released, pushed to his knees on the floor, unhurt, and the operative who'd grabbed him had repositioned to the east corner. The one doing the phone sweep was 3 tables away now, working toward Logan's section. Logan watched the phone sweep operative's pattern, calculated the next table, the angle of approach, the positioning relative to the nearest standing hostile. In his rented tuxedo, on the cold marble floor, with his daughter's fingers still wrapped around his sleeve, and 240 people around him who had no idea what was about to happen, Logan Pierce began to move. Not visibly. Not yet. But in his mind, where the plans were already assembled and the timings were already counted, and the exits had been mapped, and the sequence had been set. He was already moving, already past the table, already past the operative, already in the space between one moment and the next where the outcome was still unwritten and everything depended on whether a single father in a too-long jacket could convince 8 professionals that he was exactly what he looked like. Nobody. Just a man on the floor. Not a threat. Not a problem. Not the worst thing that had ever walked into any of their lives. Not yet. The phone sweep operative reached the table 2 positions away from Logan, and Logan used the noise of that, the scraping of chairs, the small protests and then silences of people giving up their devices, to shift his weight almost imperceptibly to his right. Not standing, not even close to standing, just adjusting, the way anyone on a hard marble floor would adjust after 10 minutes, the way a body does when it gets uncomfortable. Natural, unremarkable, the kind of movement that security-trained eyes register and immediately discard as non-threat. He had learned that from a man named Chief Petty Officer Reyes, who had once told a room full of young SEALs that the most dangerous thing you could ever be was boring. Make yourself boring, Reyes had said. Make yourself the thing they looked at and already forgot. Because the moment they forget you, you own the next 3 seconds, and 3 seconds is all you ever need. Logan had thought about Reyes a lot over the years. He wondered sometimes if Reyes was still teaching. He hoped so. He shifted again. 3 inches. The operative at the next table was dropping phones into the metal-lined bag with the mechanical efficiency of someone doing a task they'd practiced, not thinking about it, eyes moving across the room between grabs to check in with the man who was running this. That check-in happened on a rhythm. Every 8 to 10 seconds, the operative's eyes would lift, sweep left toward the lead man, come back. Logan timed it twice to confirm. 8 seconds, 9, back. The operative moved to Logan's table. Phones, he said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. He was young, mid-20s, Logan guessed, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set by force of habit rather than relaxation. He wasn't nervous. That was interesting. Young, trained, and not nervous meant either very good or very stupid, and the way he moved suggested the former. The people around Logan began reaching into jackets, opening clutches, sliding phones across the floor without looking up. Logan reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced his phone, a 3-year-old model with a cracked screen protector that Maisie had dropped in the parking lot 6 months ago, and set it on the floor and slid it forward. The operative's eyes dropped to it for exactly as long as it took to pick it up and drop it in the bag. He moved on. Logan exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, and let 3 seconds pass before he turned his head slightly toward Maisie. She was still pressed against his right side. Her grip on his sleeve had loosened slightly, which he interpreted as a good sign. The rigid terror of the first few minutes was settling into something more manageable, the particular coping mechanism of a child who had, in some ways, spent her whole life learning to read her father's temperature and calibrate her own response to it. If he was still, she could be still. That had always been the dynamic, and he didn't know whether it made him a good parent or simply a person whose child had learned to use him as a weather vane, but it was what they had. "You okay?" he breathed. She gave a single, small nod. The lead operative, Logan had started thinking of him as Accent, for the Eastern European quality of his voice, had positioned Celeste Langford near the edge of the stage. They were not on the stage yet. They were at the steps, with 2 flanking operatives and the implicit architecture of a man who was building towards something specific. Accent was talking to her in a low voice that didn't carry across the room. Celeste was standing straight, not performing bravery. Logan had been around enough people performing bravery to recognize the specific stiffness of it, but simply standing, which was its own kind of refusal to make it easy for him. Logan moved his gaze methodically around the perimeter of the room. East wall, 2 operatives positioned at the emergency exits. They hadn't moved since the initial sweep. The one on the left had shifted his weight twice in the last 8 minutes, which meant he was either tired or had a knee issue. The one on the right was the more solid of the 2. Steady, economical, watching the crowd. North wall, service corridor operative, hadn't moved. Stage left, 1 operative covering the main entrance corridor, which fed into the hotel lobby. Stage right, the one Logan had clocked late. Kitchen entrance. Now standing with his back to the wall and one hand on his rifle. And the young phone sweep operative, now moving toward the back tables, now finished with the first sweep. 8 confirmed. The rough calculation he'd done earlier had included 2 to 3 unconfirmed additional. He revised that estimate downward. The room's flow had been stable for 12 minutes now, and no new actors had appeared. Probably 8 was the number. 8, with Accent running command from the center and 7 distributed around the perimeter and across the floor. 8 against 1 was not a problem he hadn't worked before. It was a problem with a solution. The solution was ugly, and the solution was loud, and the solution involved timing that would have to be near perfect, and it required Maisie to be behind that toppled chair before a single step of it began. But he wasn't ready yet. He needed more information, and Accent was about to give it to him. "I'm going to tell you exactly what we want," Accent said, loudly enough now that the words carried across the room. "And then you're going to tell me whether you want the people in this room to go home to their families, or whether they're going to spend the night here wondering what happened to you." He said it the way people say something they've said before, rehearsed but not quite memorized, the way a presentation sounds when the presenter knows the material but hasn't performed this specific version of it. That told Logan this was not a completely standard operation for these people. They had contingencies, and they had training, but this particular setup, the charity gala, the high-profile target, the technical data extraction angle, was specific, which meant they had a client. A detailed, specific operation on a particular target at a particular event meant someone had paid for the research. That was significant only in that it confirmed Celeste wasn't the orchestrator of her own misfortune. She was a target, not a participant. Logan filed it and moved on. "The research project," Accent said. "The one your advanced applications division has been running under a classified internal designation for the past 18 months. The energy grid vulnerability mapping. You know exactly what I'm referring to." Celeste looked at him. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted, and Logan, who was watching her face from 20 feet away and had once spent 3 years reading people's faces in conditions a lot more pressurized than a charity ballroom, clocked it. She knew what he was talking about. "That project," she said carefully, "is classified for very specific reasons." "I'm sure it is." "If it were released—" "I know what would happen if it were released," Accent said, with the slight impatience of someone who'd anticipated this argument. "I also know that you have remote access to those files from any secured device, and I know that your personal access credentials are the only single-factor entry point that bypasses your company's standard multi-layer verification. So what I need from you is very simple." A pause. "Your phone, your biometric signature, and 3 minutes of cooperation." Silence settled over the room like a thing with weight. Logan did the math quickly, the way he always did. Not just the tactical math, but the larger math, the problem frame math. Energy grid vulnerability mapping, 18 months of development, classified at the executive level. The kind of data that showed exactly where critical infrastructure was exposed. Power grids, water systems, communications networks. The kind of mapping that governments paid billions to develop and paid more to keep buried because publishing it was the rough equivalent of handing a detailed floor plan of every bank in the country to every would-be robber on the continent. If that data hit the open market, or worse, went to a specific buyer, the downstream consequences were the kind Logan had seen movies about and had also once, in a different life, briefly been briefed on in a room with no windows. He understood now why they hadn't tried to extract Celeste quietly. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was a forced transaction, which was worse, because a kidnapping had a geographic solution. This had an encrypted access solution, and the only key was standing in a green dress on the steps of a stage while 240 people sat on marble floors and tried to breathe normally. "I'm not giving you those files," Celeste said. Accent looked at her without expression. "That's the first time you've said something I expected." "Then I'll try to keep surprising you." There was a beat, not quite humor, but the recognition of it. And then Accent turned and gave a slow, deliberate nod to the operative on his left. What happened next took roughly 4 seconds and changed the temperature in the room completely. The operative moved to the nearest table, third from the front, occupied by a couple in their 40s, and a younger woman who appeared to be someone's assistant. And he reached down and took the younger woman by the wrist and pulled her upright. She was maybe 25 in a black dress, and she made a sound that was barely a sound at all, more of a compressed breath, and she looked at the operative and then at Celeste with the particular expression of someone who suddenly understood what role they'd been cast in. "No," Celeste said. The word came out flat and hard. "These are the terms," Accent said simply. "You give us the access." She sits back down. "We leave in 3 hours with the data transfer, and everyone in this room remembers tonight as the time they were inconvenienced at a charity gala. That is the offer. And if I refuse? Then we stop asking." The operative had the woman standing. She was shaking, visibly, the kind of shaking that the body does independently of what the mind wants, and she was pressing her lips together so hard they'd gone white. The man she'd been sitting beside, older, probably a supervisor or a colleague, had his hands flat on the floor and was staring straight ahead with the specific paralysis of someone whose mind was running through options and rejecting everyone. Logan was running through options too. The woman was 12 feet from him. The operative holding her was standing with his back at a 30-degree angle away from Logan, which meant his peripheral vision on Logan's position was limited. The nearest covering operative, east wall, left position, was 22 feet away and had a sight line that would pick up movement in Logan's area, but not immediately distinguish what kind of movement. The second operative from the east wall would have a better sight line, but was currently focused on the stage scenario, as every set of eyes in the room was. 30 seconds. That was the window. Maybe less. The problem was Maisie. She was still beside him, still pressed against his arm. The gap behind the toppled chair was still 12 feet to his left, still accessible. But getting her there required time he wasn't sure he had, and making it look casual required conditions that were rapidly becoming less casual. He turned his head toward her. Very slowly, the way a person turns when they're settling into a slightly different position on a hard floor. He brought his lips close to her ear. "Remember what I told you," he said. "The chair." She stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Not yet," he said, "but soon. You hear me say the word now, you go. You go fast and you go low and you don't look back at me. You just go." He felt her nod against his shoulder. "I'll come to you," he said. "Promise," she said. Not a question, a requirement. "Promise." He straightened up slightly, redirected his eyes to the front of the room, and went very still. At the stage steps, the negotiation was deteriorating in the specific way negotiations deteriorate when one party has made a decision and is only going through the motions of discussion for the benefit of the audience. Accent had crossed his arms. The operative was still holding the young woman by the wrist. A third operative had moved down from the stage area and positioned himself directly behind Celeste, close enough to grab her if she ran, far enough back to not crowd the scene. "Last time," Accent said. His voice had lost the controlled quality. Not angry, colder than angry. The kind of cold that comes from deciding. "The access codes. I've told you. I heard what you told me." He turned to the operative. "Take her to the stage." The young woman's sharp inhale cut across the silence. She stumbled as the operative moved her toward the steps, and the stumble caused the man at her table to make an involuntary movement, just a flinch, a half rise. And the operative on the east wall immediately raised his weapon and pointed it at that table. And the man froze and sat back down, and the sound the woman made when she saw the weapon was small and terrible. Logan felt the 3 seconds begin to compress. This was the moment problems announced themselves. The moment when the people running the operation made the move they'd been building toward. And after that move, the scenario had a new shape, a new logic. And the new logic of this particular scenario was that Accent was going to take that woman onto the stage and use her as a very explicit demonstration. And after the demonstration would be over, and a different kind of math would begin. He looked at the east wall operative, the left position, still watching the crowd. He looked at the phone sweep operative, now positioned near the back tables, bag in hand, facing away from Logan's area. He looked at the young woman being walked toward the stage steps. He thought about the way Reyes used to end those sessions. 3 seconds, he'd say. That's all anyone ever gets. The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is what you do with 3 seconds when they arrive. Logan Pierce had been sitting on the floor of a ballroom for 14 minutes, doing calculations he'd tried to stop doing 5 years ago when he came home for good. He'd been trying to be a father, attending a charity event with his daughter. He'd been trying to be nobody. He turned his head one more time. Maisie, Yeah? Now. She went. He heard her moving, the soft drag of her dress on the marble, the small sounds of a 9-year-old trying to be quiet. And he did not look at her, because looking at her would draw eyes toward her, and instead he turned his full attention to the operative 4 feet to his left, who had just turned back toward the front of the room after completing the phone sweep, and who had a weapon in a shoulder holster and a hand radio on his belt, and who was, at this precise moment, not watching Logan. Logan stood up. Not fast. Not the way movies made it look. He rose like a man who needed to stretch, one hand going to the floor to push himself up, knees first, the way middle-aged men rose from hard floors after too long sitting. He was upright for exactly 1 second before the operative nearest to him registered the movement and started to turn, and Logan covered the 4 feet between them in a time that had nothing to do with middle age or rented tuxedos, and the operative's turning was interrupted. There was a brief controlled chaos that involved very little sound. Logan came in low, inside the operative's reach, one hand going to the gun wrist and the other to the back of the neck, and the motion that followed was the kind that SEAL instructors demonstrated once, and then had you practice until it was in the body and not the mind, until it required no thought at all, only the clean execution of a decision that had already been made. The operative went down onto one knee. The weapon came free of the holster. Logan put a forearm across the man's throat from behind and brought him close, using his body as a shield against the east wall sightlines, and held him there. The entire thing had taken 4 seconds. The problem was that 4 seconds, in a room that had been holding its breath, was audible. The east wall operative on the right had seen it. He didn't shout immediately. Trained people didn't shout immediately. They assessed. But his weapon came up and his head turned toward Accent, and Logan had a window of maybe 2 more seconds before the assessment was complete and the response came, and he spent those 2 seconds moving laterally, keeping the kneeling operative between himself and the east wall, reaching the gap between 2 overturned tables that he had mentally marked 11 minutes ago as the best partial cover position in the room's northeast quadrant. "Hey!" The shout came from the east wall right position. The room, which had been in a kind of traumatized suspension, cracked open. Someone screamed. Someone else dropped flat. The man at the table with the young woman, the supervisor, the colleague, did something brave and probably not fully thought through, and grabbed his table and upended it. And the crash of china and silverware was enormous and disorienting, and in the disorientation Logan moved again, pulling the kneeling operative with him, keeping the man's body between himself and the approaching threat. "Stop!" Accent's voice cut across everything, not a shout. A command, and the voice behind it was the voice of someone who had the room's compliance wired to something real. Everyone stopped. Even the east wall operatives paused. Logan stopped too. He was half crouched behind the overturned table with the operative pulled against him and the man's weapon now in Logan's right hand pointed at the floor. His breath was elevated but controlled. His hands were steady. The room had gone absolutely silent. Accent turned slowly from the stage steps and looked across the ballroom at Logan. It was the look of a man recalculating. Not panicking, Logan gave him that, but recalculating the way professionals recalculate when something they didn't account for has appeared. His eyes moved from Logan to the operative to the weapon to Logan's stance, and Logan watched the man's assessment process in real time and saw the exact moment it reached its conclusion. "Interesting," Accent said. His voice was flat. Not impressed. Not rattled. Just recalibrated. "Put the gun down," he said. "And my man?" Logan said nothing. "You're one person," Accent said, still in that flat, even tone. He took 2 steps toward the center of the room, not toward Logan, just repositioning so his sightlines were better. "There are 7 more of us. You're holding a weapon that you could fire, yes, but firing it in a room with 240 civilians has a particular calculus that I think you understand." He was right. Logan understood it. The weapon in his hand was a factor, not a solution. Firing in a crowded room in the dark with operatives positioned around all 4 walls was the kind of decision that turned a hostage situation into a massacre, and everyone in this room was the reason that math didn't work. "What I'm wondering," Accent continued, moving another slow step, "is who you are. Because whoever you are, you're not a guest at a charity gala." Logan's jaw was tight. He said nothing. "You took down my associate in 4 seconds," Accent said. In the dark, from the floor. You knew where we all were before we came in, or you've been mapping us since we arrived. Either option is interesting. He stopped moving. He tilted his head slightly. Military? Silence. It doesn't matter, Accent said. What matters is that you are one person, and I am about to give you a choice. You release my associate, you put the weapon on the floor, and you sit back down, and I will allow your daughter to remain unharmed. The word daughter landed like a stone in cold water. Logan did not react. He kept his face neutral, kept his hand steady, kept his breathing controlled. But something shifted behind his eyes, and Accent, who was also very good at reading rooms, caught it. She's behind the overturned chair, Accent said quietly. The one on the left. She went there about 40 seconds ago. I noticed. He paused. I noticed things too. The operative on Logan's left, kitchen entrance, the one who'd come in late, had begun moving slowly toward the north side of the room, toward the chair. Not fast, not aggressive, just moving. Logan tracked it. Here is what happens now, Accent said. You step out from behind that table. My man goes back to his position. The weapon goes on the floor, and we all continue as if the last minute didn't happen. He looked at Logan steadily. Or I send 2 of my people to collect your daughter, and we have a different kind of conversation about what cooperation looks like. The kitchen operative had stopped halfway to the chair, waiting. Logan held the position for 2 more seconds. He was aware of the weight of the weapon in his hand. He was aware of the marble floor under his feet and the smell of spilled wine from the overturned table and the sound of someone crying quietly somewhere to his left. A low, persistent sound that was mostly breath and very little noise. He was aware of Maisie, 9 years old, behind a chair with a gold back 12 feet away, curled up in the dark in a navy blue dress, waiting for him to come back to her the way he had always come back. He was aware that he was one person. He looked at Accent. He put the weapon on the floor. The operative he'd been holding straightened up, pulled away from him, and turned around with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to retaliate immediately or wait. He waited. Logan stepped out from behind the table with his hands at his sides and stood in the open floor of the ballroom in his rented tuxedo, and Accent looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was as close to respect as Logan suspected this man ever got. Back to the floor, Accent said. Logan lowered himself to his knees and then to the floor, slowly, and the kitchen operative stopped moving toward the chair, and the east wall right position lowered his weapon slightly, and the room exhaled. It wasn't over. Not even close. Logan had wanted to see how they responded, and now he knew. Accent was sharp, controlled, and had resources to spare. The operatives were trained. The threat to Maisie was real and calibrated. Accent had deployed it precisely, which meant he would deploy it again. The weapon Logan had taken was back in the operative's holster. Logan was back on the floor. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, Logan had 4 new pieces of information that he hadn't had before. He knew the kitchen operative's response time and path of movement. He knew the east wall right position's reaction sequence, which involved a 3-second assessment delay before weapon raise, 3 seconds Logan now owned. He knew that Accent ran his command from center floor and did not move to cover, which meant that in any fluid situation, Accent would be briefly exposed. And he knew that the operative he'd taken down got up with a slight hitch on his left side, which meant something in the knee or hip that would affect his speed and his pivot range. He lay flat on the cold marble and stared at the ceiling and breathed slowly. At the stage, Celeste Langford had watched all of it. The young woman had been placed back at her table, but not released, but seated, a temporary stay. Accent had walked back towards Celeste as though the interruption had been a minor administrative delay. Your volunteer, he said, nodding toward Logan without looking at him, just demonstrated that some of your fellow guests are not who they appear to be. If there are others, I'd encourage them to reconsider. He turned back to Celeste. Now. The files. You're going to take them and kill everyone in here anyway, Celeste said. Her voice had changed. The careful management was fraying slightly at the edges. Not breaking. Fraying. We both know that. That's a pessimistic view. It's a realistic view. You let 240 witnesses walk out of here with your faces, your voices, everything, and your operation is done. Whatever your client paid for this, it doesn't cover the exposure of a room full of identifying witnesses. Accent looked at her. My client is very thorough. So am I, she said. On the floor, 20 feet away, Logan Pierce turned that exchange over in his mind. He looked at the ceiling. He counted the seconds. He thought about Maisie behind the chair. He thought about the young woman at the third table. He thought about 240 people who had come to a charity gala and were now hostages in the dark. He thought about what Reyes had said. 3 seconds. That's all anyone ever gets. He closed his eyes. He started over from the beginning, running the sequence from scratch, applying everything he now knew. The kitchen operative's path. The east wall delay. Accent center positioning. The hitch in the left knee. The weapon now back in its holster. The service corridor on the north wall that led, based on the building layout he'd been quietly reconstructing from the fire exit diagrams he'd clocked near the bathrooms an hour ago, to the hotel's maintenance level, and from there to a secondary stairwell that would not be covered. He opened his eyes. The plan that was forming was not a good plan. It had multiple points of failure, and it depended on timing that would need to be near perfect, and it was going to hurt, and the odds of it ending cleanly were not high. It was also the only plan he had. He turned his head carefully and looked toward the toppled gold-backed chair 12 feet to his left. In the shadow behind the tablecloth, barely visible, 2 patent leather shoes and the hem of a navy blue dress. Still there. He let himself feel that for exactly 1 second. The relief of it. Then he put it away. There would be time to feel things later. Right now there was only the room, and the distance between here and what had to happen next, and a single father in a too-long jacket quietly becoming, one more time, the thing he'd spent 5 years trying not to be. The room had been quiet for 11 minutes. Not the comfortable quiet of a room between conversations, but the compressed, airless quiet of 240 people trying to take up as little space as possible. Someone near the back had stopped crying. The string quartet's instruments were abandoned on their stands near the bar, the bows lying across the chairs at odd angles like something a child had left behind. The chandeliers were still dead. The emergency lighting continued its flat, unflattering work across everything, draining the color out of the tablecloths and the evening gowns and the faces on the floor until the whole room looked like a photograph from a different era. Logan had been doing what he did on cold floors in difficult rooms, which was think without looking like he was thinking. He had the sequence assembled now, not clean. It was never going to be clean, and he'd stopped expecting clean somewhere around his 3rd deployment when he'd understood that clean was a story people told afterward to make the chaos manageable in memory. What he had was a sequence with the best odds available given the materials on hand, which were 1 man, no weapon, a room full of civilians he could not endanger, and an operative team that had now confirmed its positioning and response patterns through the brief exchange 8 minutes ago. The East Wall Right operative's 3-second assessment delay was the hinge. Everything else hung off that. The service corridor operative on the north wall had not moved in 22 minutes, and his attention had been fixed on the stage since Accent had taken Celeste to the steps. That pattern of fixation was both understandable and a problem for him specifically. Operatives who locked attention on the primary drama, the thing that felt most significant in the room, were operatives who had closed off half their peripheral awareness. It happened to professionals and amateurs alike. It was human. The kitchen operative, the one who'd moved toward Maisie's position before stopping, was now back at the east side of the room, but closer to center than he'd been before. Repositioned. That was the biggest variable. His original spot had been predictable. This new spot meant he could cover 2 approaches simultaneously, which was smart and annoying and something Logan filed carefully. Accent had moved Celeste up the 3 steps to the stage itself. It had happened gradually, in the way that pressure applied steadily eventually moves things that outright force cannot. Celeste had held her ground on the steps for as long as there was something to hold, but there was a point, Logan had watched it arrive, where Accent had leaned in close and said something very quietly that Logan couldn't hear, and whatever it was had been enough. Not enough to break her, but enough to move her feet. She was now standing center stage with the kind of overhead lighting that hotels used for award presentations and speeches. It caught the green of her dress and made her look like a woman posed for a portrait rather than a hostage. And Logan suspected from the quality of her expression that she was also aware of the irony. Accent stood 3 feet to her left. Another operative was positioned at stage right. A third had taken up a spot at the base of the stage steps, bottom of the stairs, body angled outward, covering the floor approach. 3 at the stage. 3 on the perimeter walls. 2 mobile, the kitchen operative and the phone sweep operative, who had been reassigned to a slow circuit of the room's interior, walking in a loose figure-8 pattern between the tables. Logan recalculated against this new configuration. The figure-8 circuit was the new complication. Its timing was irregular, not a fixed loop, but responsive to the room, pausing when something caught attention, speeding through sections that seemed settled. Unpredictable timing in a mobile operative was the kind of problem that ate plans from the inside. He needed to start before the circuit brought that operative back to the northeast quadrant. He had roughly 4 minutes. He turned his head toward the chair. "Maisie," he said, barely sound, just breath shaped into her name. A pause. Then in the same register, "I'm here. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to stay still while I talk. Can you do that?" Another pause. "Yes." "When I move," he said, "things are going to get loud. There's going to be a lot of noise and maybe some people yelling. When that happens, you stay exactly where you are. You do not come to me. You do not look for me. You stay behind that chair and you press yourself as flat as you can get, and you do not move until someone you know by name tells you it's safe. Do you understand?" The silence stretched 1 beat too long, and Logan knew she was working through the same calculation that 9-year-old minds worked through when they were being asked to do something that felt like the opposite of what they wanted to do. "What if it takes a long time?" she said. "Then it takes a long time. What if— Maisie?" He kept his voice steady. "I need you to trust me." He heard her exhale, small, controlled, in the way she'd learned to be controlled when she was following his lead, which she had been doing in various forms since she was 3 years old. "Okay," she said. He stayed still for 10 more seconds. Then, on a slow breath out, Logan Pierce began to move. He started with his hands. Just a repositioning, palms down, weight shifting forward in the incremental way that someone adjusts who has been lying on hard marble for 30 minutes and is trying not to draw attention to a hip that has gone slightly numb. He did this twice over 90 seconds, each shift moving him fractionally forward and left, compressing the distance between himself and the stage step operative in tiny justifiable installments. The figure-8 operative passed through the northeast section and moved away. Logan had 4 minutes, maybe 3. The stage step operative was standing with his back mostly to the room, which was a positioning error. The man was focused on protecting the stage approach from the floor, which meant his field of awareness was angled forward and inward rather than broadly peripheral. It was the kind of mistake that happened when an operation was running on a single directive for too long. Their objective was Celeste and the data, and after 25 minutes in the room, the team had settled into the complacent posture of people who believed the major variable, the man who'd gotten up from the floor, had been resolved. They had put him back on the floor. They had stopped thinking about him. Logan came up off the floor in a motion that was not like the movies and not like training videos and not like anything that had a particular visual elegance to it. It was fast and ugly, and it covered the ground between himself and the stage step operative in approximately 2 seconds. And what happened when he reached the man was exactly as controlled as he could make it, in a space where any stray movement had consequences. He took the man from behind, hand over the mouth, his forearm driving the neck forward and down in a hold that compressed and controlled without the kind of force that put people in hospitals. The operative made a muffled sound and reached for the weapon at his hip, and Logan got there first. 1 second, 2, and then the man's legs buckled and he went down slowly, and Logan lowered him to the floor behind the nearest table as though he were setting something fragile on a shelf. The whole thing produced less noise than a chair scraping. He had the weapon now. He stayed down, flat behind the table, and counted. 1, 2, 3. No shout, no alarm. The perimeter operative's attention was still on the stage, where Accent had begun a different kind of pressure campaign. Logan could hear it from the floor, the tone of something reaching its final stage. And the figure-8 operative was somewhere on the south side of the room. He had not been seen. He had about 90 seconds before the figure-8 operative's circuit brought him back around, and the stage step operative's absence would register to whoever was supposed to be watching him, and everything shifted into response mode. Logan moved again. He came up in a low crouch, using the tables for cover, and crossed the floor in the gap between the east wall operative's fixed position and the blind spot created by a cluster of overturned chairs near the front tables, and he was at the base of the stage steps before he straightened to full height. The operative at stage right saw him first. The man had a half second, maybe less, and he used it to bring his weapon up rather than shout, which was a trained reflex, and Logan was already inside the weapon's useful range, driving the gun hand upward and sideways with his left palm while his right elbow came across in a controlled strike that was not intended to injure, but to interrupt. The weapon discharged once into the ceiling. The sound of it inside the ballroom was enormous. Everything exploded. The screaming started. Real screaming. Not the managed terror of before, but the kind that happens when a gun fires in a closed space and the body stops pretending it's going to be fine. People were moving, some pressing flat, some curling up, some doing the instinctive terrible thing of trying to run for exits that were covered. Logan heard shouting from the perimeter operatives. He heard Accent's voice cutting through it all, sharp and commanding, redirecting his team. He had maybe 20 seconds of controlled chaos to work with. He took the stage right operative's weapon, cleared the man from his path, and turned towards center stage. Accent had Celeste by the arm. Not violent. Controlled. The grip of a man repositioning a valuable asset in a changing situation. His own weapon was out, pointed at the ceiling, his head turning as he processed the collapse of his perimeter. He had 4 operatives converging. Logan could hear the footsteps, the repositioning, the voices calling positions to each other in the shorthand of a team that trained together. "Langford," Logan said. She looked at him across the stage. Her expression in that half second was something he didn't have time to analyze. Surprise, calculation, relief, a dozen things at once. And she was already pulling against Accent's grip before Logan had finished saying her name. Accent yanked her back and turned his weapon toward Logan. "You again," Accent said. He was not panicking. Logan had to keep noting that the man wasn't panicking. He was adapting, and adapting fast was what made him genuinely dangerous. "You went down. You stayed down." "I changed my mind," Logan said. "You have a weapon." "So do you." "I have 6 operatives converging on your position." "I know," Logan said. "That's why we need to finish this before they get here." It was a bluff. Not completely, but partially, because what Logan had was a weapon and a position on the stage, an accent between himself and the primary exit from the stage, and what Logan did not have was a clean shot that didn't involve Celeste Langford being within the margin of error. He needed Accent to move 2 feet to the left or to release her, and neither of those things was something he could force from this distance in the time he had. Accent understood the geometry as well as Logan did. The man's eyes moved across the stage, measuring, the same way Logan measured, and something settled behind his expression. "You're not going to shoot," Accent said, "because she's in the way." "You're not going to shoot either," Logan said, "because she's the only reason you're here." A half second of genuine stalemate. Then Accent did something that Logan had not calculated for, which was that he shoved Celeste hard, not toward Logan, but sideways down the 3 steps to the right side of the stage, and came at Logan without a hostage, weapon first, closing the distance fast. Logan moved left. The weapon discharged. He felt the air move near his shoulder in a way he did not enjoy, and then Accent was inside Logan's extended range, and it stopped being about guns and became something else entirely. What followed was the most physically costly 30 seconds of Logan's evening. Accent was good. Not SEAL-trained good, but close to it. The kind of hand-to-hand that came from 10 or 15 years of professional application. The kind where the techniques were simple because they'd been boiled down to the things that actually worked versus the things that looked impressive. He hit hard, and he recovered fast, and the thing about the knee that Logan had noted earlier, the hitch on the left, turned out to be a chronic issue that affected exactly one movement, a pivot and drive sequence that Accent avoided instinctively, which actually made him harder to read because Logan had been counting on exploiting it. Logan took an elbow across the jaw that rattled his vision sideways for 1 full second. He did not go down. He got a forearm across Accent's throat and a leg behind his knee and drove the man backward into the stage backdrop. An Accent went down but came back up fast and made it back to his feet before Logan could lock the position. And then they were both standing 3 feet apart, breathing hard. An accent had a cut above his eyebrow from the backdrop, and Logan's jaw was going to be a spectacular bruise by morning. "You're former military," Accent said. Not a question. "Yeah," Logan said. "Special operations." "Yeah." A beat. Both of them recalibrating. "You're better than I expected," Accent said. "I get that a lot," Logan said, which was not true at all, and he was aware of it. Accent came again, and this time Logan was ready for the adjustment, the slight right-favoring entry that compensated for the knee. And he let the man commit and then stepped into it rather than away from it, which was counterintuitive and wrong feeling in the moment, but was exactly the geometry that eliminated Accent's leverage. He got behind the man, arm across the throat, and this time he had the angle and the weight and the positioning right, and he held it. He held it for 5 full seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than was comfortable for either of them. And then Accent's resistance had the quality of a man who had recognized the decision that was already made, and his body stopped fighting and started conserving. Logan brought him down slowly. He lowered him to the stage floor and held the position for another 3 seconds, and then stepped back, breathing hard, and picked up the weapon that had skidded to the edge of the stage during the exchange. He stood up. The 4 converging operatives had stopped. They were spread across the floor of the ballroom, weapons raised, and Logan was standing on the stage above them with their team leader on the floor, and the mathematics of the situation had changed in the way that mathematics changed when the key variable was removed from one side of the equation. The room was not quiet. It was still making the sounds that rooms make when people are frightened and uncertain and trying to determine whether the thing that just happened is the end of something or the middle of it. But the chaotic noise had settled into a different register. Lower, more watchful, the sound of 240 people holding their breath in synchronized uncertainty. Logan stood where he was and looked at the 4 operatives on the floor. He was aware of his jaw. He was aware of his hands, which were steady but tired. He was aware that he was standing in the center of a stage in a rented tuxedo with a bow tie that had come partially undone sometime in the last 30 seconds, holding a weapon on 4 armed men who had not yet decided what to do, and that the next 10 seconds were going to determine whether this was the part of the story that ended well or the part that simply ended. "Put them down," Logan said. His voice carried across the room cleanly, without performance, the way voices carry when the room is listening and the person speaking doesn't need to work at it. "Your team leader is down. The perimeter is about to be compromised from outside. You've been in here long enough that the hotel's emergency protocols triggered an automatic police alert, and that happened about 8 minutes ago, which means you have less time than you think. Put them down and get on the floor." This was a partial bluff. He did not actually know whether the hotel's emergency protocols had triggered. He knew that the signal jamming had been in place, but that jamming had a range, and the hotel's hardwired emergency line might or might not have been on a separate system. But partial bluffs were the kind that worked, because they were built on possibilities the other side could not fully rule out. The 4 operatives looked at each other. One of them, the east wall left position, the one Logan had noted shifting weight, the possible knee issue, glanced toward the stage and then back at his colleagues and made the decision that one person usually made in these situations when the calculus had turned, which was the decision to stop. He lowered his weapon to the floor. The others followed. Not immediately. It took another 6 seconds, and one of them held his position for 4 of those 6 seconds with his weapon still raised and his eyes on Logan in a specific way that Logan recognized as a man genuinely weighing his options, and Logan held the man's gaze steadily and did not flinch, and the man put his weapon down. They got on the floor. Logan kept his position for another 10 seconds, confirming the North Wall Service Corridor operative, still at his post, hadn't moved, was watching the stage with the specific expression of someone whose plan had stopped working. And the phone sweep operative, who was standing in the south side of the room with his hand slowly rising without anyone asking him to. 7. The 8th, the stage right operative Logan had cleared at the beginning, was still on the ground near the stage steps. He turned. Celeste Langford was on her feet near the bottom of the stage steps, her dress dusty at the hem from the floor, her expression doing something complicated that she was clearly in the process of deciding how to manage. She had a small abrasion on her left palm from when she'd caught herself on the steps. "Are you hurt?" Logan asked. She looked at her hand. Then, At him. No. A pause. You? He touched his jaw briefly. I'll live. That was... She stopped, started again. That was remarkable. It wasn't, he said, and meant it. What it was necessary, and those were different things, and he was too tired right now to explain the difference. He came down the steps. He crossed the ballroom floor, keeping his eye on the positioned operatives, on Accent still down on the stage, on the service corridor operative who had finally and reluctantly lowered himself to the floor, and he went directly to the northeast section of the room and the toppled chair with the gold back. He crouched down. He lifted the tablecloth. Maisie was curled in the space behind the chair with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them and her face turned toward him when the light came in. Her eyes were dry. She hadn't cried, which told him something about what she'd been doing in the dark, which was the same thing he'd been doing across the room, which was holding it together on the inside and keeping the outside very still. She had her mother's stubborn composure in that way. It had always been one of the things about her that made his chest hurt in a specific and irreducible fashion. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. He held out his hand. She took it and came out from behind the chair, slowly, unfolding herself from the cramped position, and then she was standing in front of him on the ballroom floor, and she looked at his face, at his jaw, specifically, at the mark there, and her expression tightened. You're hurt, she said. It's okay. You said you'd come back. I did come back. She looked at him for another second with the evaluating look she'd inherited from nobody he could identify, the look that was entirely her own. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around his middle and pressed her face into his jacket and held on, and he wrapped his arms around her and held on back, and he closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds and let himself do that. Just that. Just for 3 seconds. Around them, the room was beginning to wake up in the way rooms woke up after something terrible had passed. Cautious first, heads coming up, then voices, then movement, then the specific human noise of people confirming each other's reality, reaching for each other, saying things that were barely coherent but needed saying anyway. Howard, from their table, was helping Margaret to her feet. The young woman in the black dress was sitting upright, with her hands pressed flat on the floor in front of her, as if testing whether the ground was real. The man who'd upended the table, the supervisor, the colleague, was standing and looking at his own hands with the expression of someone who had done something instinctive and was now processing whether it had been brave or foolish and had settled on both. Logan straightened up. He kept one hand on Maisie's shoulder. He looked at the room. Accent was still on the stage, beginning to stir. The service corridor operative had not moved from his floor position. The east wall operatives were face down with their weapons arm's length away. The phone sweep operative had sat down with his back against the wall and his hands laced on top of his head, which was the posture of someone who had decided their participation was over. From somewhere outside, through the sealed and covered doors, Logan heard something. A muffled, distant sound. Not gunfire. Not shouting. The particular acoustic signature of vehicles pulling up fast on a city street. He exhaled. Then, from the main entrance, the heavy double doors that had been sealed and covered for the last 37 minutes, there was the compressed crack of a breaching charge, and the doors came open, and the first SWAT officer was through before the smoke had cleared. They came in fast and loud, and in the way that tactical units came in when they'd been prepped outside for long enough to know the rough shape of what they were walking into. Lights and commands, and the controlled aggression of people whose job was to establish order from the outside in. Logan took 2 steps back from the center of the room and put both hands in the air. Weapon on the floor, hands in the air, face visible. The specific posture of a person who needed to be immediately readable as not a threat. And he kept Maisie behind him as the team swept through. It took 6 minutes to clear the room. Then it took another 4 minutes for someone in tactical gear to reach Logan specifically, because he was the one person in the room who didn't fit the categories of hostage or operative, and categories were how tactical units organized chaos. Sir, I need you to stay exactly where you are. I know, Logan said. I'm not moving. Can you tell me who you are? He looked at the officer, youngish, focused, doing the job. Logan Pierce, he said. I'm a guest. I have no current affiliation with any law enforcement or military organization. A pause. The team leader is on the stage. He needs medical attention. He's going to have some cervical bruising. The man by the stage steps needs to be evaluated for a possible concussion. Everyone else on the floor, I think, is okay. The officer looked at him for a moment. You did this? He said. Logan looked around the room, at the 8 operatives being secured, at the 240 people being helped to their feet, at Celeste Langford, who was standing near the stage talking to 2 other officers, her green dress still immaculate except for the dusty hem and the small abrasion on her hand, her voice steady and clear as she answered their questions. He looked at his daughter, who was standing at his side with her arms wrapped around his arm, the way she had been doing all evening, and who was watching the officers sweep through the room with the specific fascinated attention of a 9-year-old who had been through something remarkable and was still in the process of deciding what it meant. I was here, Logan said. Something needed to be done. The officer wrote something on his notepad. We're going to need a statement, he said. I figured, Logan said. Across the room, Howard and Margaret were sitting together on a pair of chairs that someone had righted, and Howard had his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and Margaret was crying in the quiet way that people cried when the danger had passed, and the body finally received permission to feel what it had been holding back. The young woman in the black dress was speaking on a phone that an officer had returned to her, saying something in a voice too low to hear, and the person on the other end was apparently saying something that made her press her forehead to her palm and breathe. The string quartet instruments were still on their stands. The orchid centerpieces were still intact on the few tables that hadn't been overturned. The ivory tablecloths were ruined on half of them, wine-stained and floor-dragged, but they were still tablecloths, still laid out with their careful creases, evidence of a version of the evening that had existed for exactly 40 minutes before it became something else. Logan looked at all of it. He looked at his daughter. She tilted her head up at him. Can we go home? She said. Soon, he said. We have to talk to some people first. Are you in trouble? No. Are you sure? Yeah, he said. I'm sure. She considered this. Then she leaned her head against his arm and looked at the SWAT officers working the room and said, in the matter-of-fact tone that 9-year-olds use to process extraordinary things, I heard the gun go off, the one on the stage. I know. Were you scared? He thought about this honestly, which was how he tried to answer her questions, because she was old enough to know when he wasn't. For a second, he said. What second? He looked down at her, at the navy blue dress and the patent leather shoes and the dark curly hair that she was growing to her waist for reasons that had never been fully explained to him. She was 9 years old, and she had been behind a chair in the dark for 37 minutes, and she was asking him questions in the way that she always asked him questions, which was directly and without decoration. When I heard the gun, he said, before I knew where you were. She nodded slowly, processed it. But then you knew. But then I knew, he said. She nodded again and said nothing else. And that was the end of that conversation. And Logan Pierce stood on the ballroom floor in his rented tuxedo with his daughter pressed against his arm and the adrenaline metabolizing slowly out of his system, and he let the professionals do what the professionals did, and he waited. The statement took 2 hours and 14 minutes. They did it in a conference room on the hotel's second floor, a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee and had a whiteboard on one wall with someone's project timeline still written on it from a meeting that had happened that morning, in a version of the world where a Tuesday evening charity gala was just a charity gala. A detective named Carver ran the questioning. He was in his mid-40s, methodical, with the kind of face that gave away nothing and had probably stopped giving things away sometime in his 30s. He had a younger partner named Osei, who took notes on a laptop and occasionally asked follow-up questions that were better than Carver's, a fact that Carver either didn't notice or had made his peace with. Maisie sat in the corner of the room in a chair that someone had pulled away from the conference table for her, wrapped in an emergency thermal blanket that a paramedic had insisted on even though she wasn't in shock, just cold, because the hotel's climate control had done something unpredictable when the power was partially cut and the ballroom had been cooling steadily for the last hour. She had a cup of hot chocolate that someone had produced from somewhere, Logan didn't know who, didn't ask, and she was drinking it in small, careful sips and watching the interview with the focused attention of someone who was absolutely paying attention and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Logan answered everything Carver asked him, He answered it in the same way he'd been trained to debrief, chronologically, specifically, without editorializing or speculating beyond what he had directly observed. He told them about the positioning he'd clocked before the operatives moved. He told them about the phone sweep pattern and the signal jamming and the service corridor. He told them about the sequence on the stage, including the discharge into the ceiling, the location of the round — Carver would want that for the forensics — and the engagement with the team leader. He did not minimize anything. He also did not dramatize anything, because dramatizing was the thing people did when they needed the story to validate the choices, and Logan had made his choices for reasons that didn't require validation. "You neutralized 8 armed operatives," Carver said at one point, in the tone of a man reading back notes to confirm he'd heard correctly. "With assistance," Logan said, "the man who upended the table, the one in the gray suit, that created a distraction I used, and one of the operatives on the east wall made the decision to stand down voluntarily, which influenced the others." Carver looked at him over his notepad. "Most people in that room spent the evening on the floor. Most people in that room didn't have a reason to do otherwise. And you did." Logan thought about how to answer that. "I had the training," he said finally. "That's not the same thing as a reason, but when you have a specific capability and someone in front of you needs it, the decision kind of makes itself." Osei looked up from his laptop. "You said you're a single father, that you've been out of the service for 5 years. 6, Logan said. "Almost 6. What do you do now?" "Contract maintenance work, building systems, HVAC, some electrical. I have a small business, mostly commercial clients, a few residential." Osei nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing something away. "And before that, Navy SEAL. SEAL Team 3. 8 years active duty, 2 years in a training and development role at Coronado before I separated." "Why'd you leave?" Logan looked at him. The question wasn't relevant to the statement. Osei knew it and Logan knew it, but it was the question in the room, the one Carver had been working toward in his slow lateral fashion, and Osei had just gone straight at it. "My wife died," Logan said. "Our daughter was 3. There wasn't anyone else." The room was quiet for a moment. Maisie was looking at her hot chocolate. "I'm sorry," Osei said, and meant it. "It was a long time ago," Logan said, which was both true and not true in the way that those things were always both true and not true. Carver cleared his throat and moved on. They covered the team leader, Accent, whom the police had already run through databases and identified as a man named Dmitry Volkan, a former Eastern European Special Forces operative who had been working as a private security contractor for the last 8 years and had a file in 3 different countries' intelligence databases that Carver was not at liberty to detail, but had clearly read with some interest. Logan had not known the man's name and said so. He gave them everything he'd observed about command structure, communications patterns, and the operational details that suggested professional training and a well-resourced client behind the operation. "The data they wanted," Logan said, "the energy grid vulnerability mapping. That's what this was about. Whoever hired them didn't care about Langford herself. She was the access point. The data was the target." Carver nodded. "We're aware. The client is still out there." "We're aware of that too." "Is Langford's security situation being—" "Mr. Pierce," Carver's voice was not unkind. "We have it." Logan sat back. He recognized the tone. The professional closure of a man telling another professional that the handoff was complete and the baton had been passed and it was time to stop running. He accepted it the way he'd accepted it before, in rooms that smelled different but had the same essential quality of finality. He was done here. The formal part, anyway. They let him go at midnight. Maisie had fallen asleep in the chair at some point in the last 40 minutes. The hot chocolate cup balanced on the armrest, her head tilted sideways against the wall, the thermal blanket tucked up around her shoulders. And Logan gathered her up without waking her, the way he'd been gathering her up since she was an infant, with the particular practiced efficiency of a person who had done this specific thing several thousand times. She stirred slightly and then settled, her face pressing into his neck, and he adjusted her weight against his shoulder and carried her out of the conference room. The hotel corridor was still active. Police, hotel staff, a few people from the gala who hadn't yet been cleared to leave, a camera crew from a local news station that had been stopped at the lobby entrance and was conducting interviews with whoever would talk to them through the glass doors. Logan kept his head down and moved toward the elevator. Mr. Pierce. He turned. Celeste Langford was standing in the corridor 20 feet back, still in the green dress, with a blazer now over her shoulders that didn't match but was clearly borrowed from someone larger. Her hair had come partially loose from whatever had been holding it up. She looked like a woman who had been through something significant and had been dealing with the administrative consequences of it for the last 2 hours and was running, visibly, on the last reserves of composure she had available. She walked toward him. He waited. She stopped a few feet away and looked at Maisie, sleeping against his shoulder. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but the way expressions shift when something small and real cuts through whatever professional register a person has been maintaining. "She okay?" Celeste said quietly. "She's tough," Logan said, which was the answer he always gave and was also true. Celeste looked at him. The directness of it was something he'd noticed from across the ballroom earlier in the evening, and it was, he found, even more direct up close. She was not the person the magazine covers had described, or maybe she was, but the version the covers used was flatter, reduced to surface qualities that were true but incomplete. The person in front of him had the quality of someone who thought faster than she spoke and had learned the hard way not to say everything she thought, and who was, at this particular moment, trying to figure out how to say something that didn't have an obvious phrasing. "I've been talking to police for 2 hours, she said, "and reporters, a little through the lobby glass, and my security director, who is currently having what I can only describe as a very passionate crisis of professional confidence." A pause. "And I haven't said thank you yet." "You don't need to," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." "Those are different things." He looked at her. She was right. They were different things. He'd said almost exactly that to Maisie earlier in the evening. A different context, same principle. "You're welcome," he said. She exhaled. It was a very human sound, patan, the specific sound of a breath that had been held for longer than it should have been. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm asking as a person, not as someone who runs a company or sits on boards or any of that. Just as a person." "Okay." "Why did you do it?" she said. "You were on the floor. You put the gun down. You were back on the floor. You could have stayed there." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved because she was asking it seriously and she deserved a serious answer. "They were going to hurt you," he said, "and they were going to hurt other people in that room. And I was the only person in that room who had the specific training to do something about it." He shifted Maisie's weight slightly on his shoulder. "That's it. That's the whole thing. That's not a small thing." "I know, but it's not complicated either." She studied him for a moment. "Who are you? I mean, I know your name, the police told me. I know you were a SEAL, but who are you, actually?" "I'm a maintenance contractor," he said. "I fix building systems. I have a business license and a 9-year-old in a truck that needs new brakes." He paused. "I was a different person once. That person had useful skills. Tonight those skills were useful again." "Do you miss it?" she said. The other version. It was a question that people asked him sometimes, and it was the kind of question that had a simple answer and a true answer, and they were not the same answer. The simple answer was no, because the simple answer protected the life he'd built and the choices he'd made. The true answer was more like he missed the clarity of it, the way things were precisely defined in that life: mission, threat, asset, objective. And he did not miss what the clarity had cost him, which was considerable. "Sometimes I miss the certainty," he said. "Everything else? No." Celeste nodded slowly, as though he'd confirmed something she'd been working through. "The police are going to release a statement tomorrow. There's going to be press. A lot of it." She paused. "Your name is going to be in it." "I figured. Are you okay with that?" He looked at her. The question was genuine. She was actually asking, not just warning. "Does it matter if I'm not?" he said, without bitterness. "It matters to me," she said. "I'm not going to let them turn you into a headline without your consent. I have some capacity to shape what gets said and what doesn't." She met his eyes. "I wanted you to know that." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the offer that he didn't entirely know how to receive. not because it was unwelcome, but because it was offered without condition, which in his experience was rarer than it should have been. "I appreciate that," he said. She nodded. "Go take your daughter home," she said. "She's had a long enough night." "So have you," he said. For the first time since he'd seen her, something close to a genuine smile moved across her face. Not the polished, camera-ready version from the magazine covers, but the smaller, tireder, realer version that people produced when they'd stopped performing and simply responded. "Yeah," she said. "I have." He carried Maisie to the elevator and pressed the lobby button and rode down in the hum of it, her weight familiar and good against his shoulder, her breathing slow and even. The lobby was controlled chaos, police presence, a few remaining guests, the news crew still visible through the glass front doors where the lights from their camera van made everything outside look clinical and overexposed. Logan kept to the side of the lobby, away from the glass, and found a hotel side exit that led out onto a service street running parallel to the main entrance. He'd noted it when they arrived, a habit, not a plan, and now it was useful. The night air was cold and clean after hours inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, Maisie sleeping on his shoulder. The city doing what cities did at midnight, which was continue existing in its particular indifferent fashion. His car was in the hotel's parking structure on the east side. He started walking. He passed a police cruiser and 2 unmarked vehicles, and a mobile command unit that had been set up on the street outside the main entrance, and a cluster of officers talking around a folding table, and none of them looked at him twice. He was a man in a rented tuxedo carrying a sleeping child through a parking structure at midnight. He was nobody. He was exactly what he looked like. He found his truck on the 3rd level. It was a 2017 model with a dent on the passenger door from a parking lot incident 2 years ago that he kept meaning to get fixed and hadn't. And the back seat had a jacket Maisie had left there 4 days ago and a paper bag from a drive-thru that he should have thrown away. He got the back door open, laid Maisie down across the back seat, got the seatbelt around her without waking her, and closed the door. He stood by the truck for a moment. His jaw hurt. The bruise was settling in now that the adrenaline had finished its work. A deep ache that would be worse by morning and worse still the day after. His right hand had a scrape across the knuckles from the stage engagement that he hadn't noticed until now, and it had dried and wasn't serious. His left shoulder had a stiffness that he recognized as the beginning of something that would benefit from ice and rest, both of which he would have limited access to in the immediate term. He was fine. He'd been worse. He got in the truck and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting it. Through the parking structure's open sides, he could see the lights of the city. The distant glow of office towers still lit, the red and blue strobes from the police presence on the street below, the ordinary yellow of street lamps running down the block in both directions. He watched it for a minute. Just that. He thought about Sarah, the way he thought about her sometimes late at night when things happened that she should have been there for. Not with grief, exactly. That was too active a word for it. More like the specific awareness of an absence, the way you notice a missing step when you're walking stairs in the dark. She would have had things to say about tonight. He wasn't sure what exactly. Probably something that was simultaneously practical and quietly furious, because that had been her register. He thought about the look on Maisie's face when he'd lifted the tablecloth. Not the relief of it, but the dryness of her eyes. She'd held it together in the dark for 37 minutes, and she had not fallen apart, and she was 9 years old. He didn't know whether that was a testament to her resilience or to the particular childhood she'd had, which had required her to develop resilience in ways that most children's childhoods did not. He suspected it was both, and he suspected that the distinction mattered, and he also suspected that he was not qualified to work through that particular question alone on a cold Tuesday night in a parking structure, and that a better time for it might exist. He started the truck. The drive home took 22 minutes. Maisie slept through all of it. He carried her inside and up the stairs and put her in her bed without taking off the navy dress. She could change in the morning, and pulled the blanket over her and turned off the light. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. The stuffed elephant, Gerald, was on the floor where it always ended up. The shelf above her desk had the books she was currently reading and 3 that she'd read twice and kept anyway. Her drawings were taped to the wall above her bed. Animals, mostly, with occasional buildings and one ambitious attempt at a city skyline that she'd worked on for a week. The nightlight in the corner threw a warm, low glow across all of it. He leaned against the door frame. Then he went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands and breathed. Not long. Just a minute. Just the specific minute that he'd been not taking since the lights had gone out in the ballroom, the minute of letting the body register what the mind had been too busy to process. He wasn't shaking. He hadn't shaken after things like this in a long time. But there was something that needed to pass through him, and he let it pass. Sitting at the kitchen table in a bow tie he'd learned to knot from the internet, in a house that was quiet and warm and real. Then he got up and got some ice from the freezer and held it against his jaw and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, which was small and had a bird feeder he kept meaning to refill and a tire swing he'd hung 2 summers ago that Maisie still used occasionally, and he stood there until the ice melted and his jaw was numb enough to be manageable. He went to bed at 2 in the morning. He didn't sleep until 3. The next day came the way days came after nights like that. Ordinary and relentless, not waiting for readiness. Maisie woke up at 7:15 and came downstairs in the navy dress, still half asleep, and stood in the kitchen doorway with her hair a complicated situation and looked at Logan's jaw with the focused attention of someone confirming a suspicion. "That looks bad," she said. "Good morning to you too. Does it hurt?" "Some." She sat down at the table. He made eggs. They ate mostly in silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence, but the specific kind of morning quiet that was simply them being in the same space without needing to narrate it. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. The refrigerator hummed. "Are we going to talk about it?" Maisie said. "About last night?" "Yes." He set down his fork. "What do you want to talk about?" She thought about this with visible seriousness. The part where the gun went off on the stage. "Okay. Were you the one who made it go off?" "No. Another person's weapon discharged. I was trying to prevent it. I got the gun arm up and sideways so it went into the ceiling instead of anywhere else." She absorbed this. "Were you trying to be a hero?" The question caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was a bad question, but because it was exactly the question, the one at the center of the thing, and she'd found it the way she found things, directly and without meandering. "No," he said. "Then why?" "Because I was there," he said. "And I could." She looked at him. "That's the same reason you said when I asked you why you were in the Navy." He hadn't remembered saying that to her, but it sounded right. "I guess it is." "Is that always going to be the reason, when you do things like that?" He looked at his daughter, at the frank, serious face she wore when she was asking real questions that she actually needed answers to. He thought about how to be honest with her in a way that was also manageable, because she was 9 and he was her father, and those two things created a specific responsibility around honesty. "I'm not planning to do things like that," he said. "That was a situation that arrived without planning. But if I'm in a room and someone needs help and I'm the person who can help, yeah, probably that's always going to be the reason." She considered this for a long moment. Then she nodded, with the particular nod she gave things she'd decided to accept, even if she hadn't fully resolved her feelings about them. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I said okay, Dad." He let it go. The news broke fully by mid-morning. Logan's name was in it. Several outlets had it, with varying degrees of accuracy about who he was and what specifically had happened. One had gotten hold of a military service photograph from somewhere, and seen it was strange, the way it was always strange to see yourself at a younger age, when the distance between then and now had content that photographs couldn't hold. He read the coverage once, skimmed it, and closed the browser. His phone had been returned to him at the hotel, retrieved from the collection bag by an officer going through the evidence protocol, and by midday it had 17 missed calls and 30-some text messages, from Danny Kowalski, from 2 former colleagues he hadn't spoken to in years, from his business clients asking if he was okay, from numbers he didn't recognize. He answered Danny's because Danny had gotten him into this in the first place and deserved a direct conversation, and Danny spent 4 minutes saying variations of "I cannot believe" and "Are you actually serious?" and "Logan, man," before eventually arriving at something coherent. "The news is saying you took down 8 guys," Danny said. 8. Danny. "Yeah?" "I need those brakes looked at on the truck. Do you still know the guy on Birch Street?" A pause. Then Danny laughed. The specific laugh of someone who has known a person long enough to understand their particular brand of deflection and has made peace with it. "Yeah," he said. "I'll text you his number." The afternoon was quiet. Logan changed the ice on his jaw twice. Maisie watched 2 episodes of a nature documentary and then came and sat beside him on the couch and did her homework with the focused efficiency of a child who understood that homework was a thing that existed even on the day after unusual Tuesday nights. Logan read. He cleaned the kitchen. He put the tire swing's chain back where it belonged after checking that the bolt in the oak tree was still secure. At 4:15, there was a knock at the door. He opened it. 2 men in dark suits stood on the front step, holding credentials that identified them as federal investigators connected to a joint task force focused on infrastructure security and organized crime. They were professional, they were polite, and they had specific questions about certain operational details from the night before that the municipal police debrief had flagged as falling within federal jurisdiction. Logan looked at them. "I need to call someone first," he said. "Of course," the first one said. He called Danny back because Danny had a brother-in-law who was a defense attorney, and the brother-in-law answered on the second ring and said he could be there in 40 minutes. And Logan told the federal investigators they were welcome to wait in their car or come in for coffee and wait in the kitchen. And the second one opted for the coffee with the weary pragmatism of a man who had been doing door knocks since 8 that morning. Maisie appeared from upstairs, assessed the situation with her particular economy of expression, and went back upstairs, and Logan heard her close her door, which was a thing she had learned meant he needed space to deal with adult things, and she would be available when the adult things were concluded. The attorney arrived in 38 minutes. His name was Fletcher, and he shook hands with both investigators and poured his own coffee without asking and sat down and said calmly, "Okay, let's hear it." It took 2 hours. The federal interest, it turned out, was less about Logan's actions specifically and more about Dmitry Volkan and the client structure behind the operation, who had commissioned it, how the target intelligence on Celeste Langford's files had been developed, and whether the data extraction attempt was part of a larger series of operations targeting critical infrastructure companies. Logan's direct knowledge was limited but specific, and he gave them what he had, and Fletcher occasionally interjected when a question moved outside what Logan directly knew into territory that might produce speculation, and the investigators accepted this with the practiced patience of people who were used to working around attorneys. By 6 o'clock, they were done. Fletcher walked them to the door. Logan stood in the kitchen and looked at the coffee cups on the table, 4 of them, an odd domestic record of an afternoon that had been unusual in the way that the previous 12 hours had been continuously unusual. And he stacked them in the sink and ran the water. "You're not in any trouble," Fletcher said, coming back into the kitchen. "You know that, right? They're not interested in you. You're actually useful to them." "I figured," Logan said. "The task force has been building a case on Volkan's network for 2 years. What happened last night gave them a physical location, a confirmed personnel roster, and a chain of custody on communications equipment that apparently is a bigger deal than I understand." "Does Langford know?" "Her legal team has been coordinating with the task force since this morning." Fletcher picked up his briefcase from the table. "Whatever was on those files, the infrastructure data, apparently it's significant enough that 3 separate government agencies are currently having arguments about jurisdiction." Logan nodded. He'd expected something like that. Fletcher paused at the kitchen doorway. "For what it's worth," he said, and his voice had dropped the professional register slightly, "Danny told me what you did in there, the whole thing." He looked at Logan with the straightforward assessment of someone who dealt in difficult truths for a living. "That was something. Danny talks too much," Logan said. Fletcher smiled. "He also cries at car commercials, but here we are." He left, and Logan heard the front door, and then the house was quiet. He stood at the sink for a moment, then he dried his hands and went upstairs and knocked on Maisie's door. "Come in." She was sitting on her bed cross-legged with Gerald the elephant in her lap, reading. She looked up. "They gone?" she said. "Yeah." "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine." She nodded. "I heard some of it," she said. "Not apologetically, just stating it." "I know." "The part about the files, the infrastructure thing." "Yeah." "Is that what it was about? Not just a robbery?" He sat on the edge of her bed. "No, not just a robbery." "Is it over now?" He thought about that honestly. For us, yeah. The rest of it takes longer. She absorbed this. The lady, she said. Langford. She was nice. You talked to her? A little. When you were doing the second statement, she came over and asked me if I needed anything, and I said I was okay, and she sat with me for a few minutes. Maisie looked down at Gerald and smoothed his ear with one thumb. She asked me about school. Logan looked at his daughter. He hadn't known this. What did you tell her? That I like science, and I'm okay at math, and I hate group projects because people don't do their share. A pause. She said she feels exactly the same way about group projects. He looked at her for a moment. Outside, the backyard was going dim in the early evening, the tire swing just visible through the window in the last of the light. Somewhere down the block, the neighbor's dog had given up on whatever it had been barking at. Dad, Maisie said. Yeah? She looked up at him. Her eyes were the same as they'd been last night in the dark, direct and clear, and waiting for honesty. You were scared, she said. When you were doing all of it, you were scared. He looked at her. Yes. But you did it anyway. Yes. She thought about this. Is that what brave means? Just doing it even when you're scared? He had been asked versions of this question by men half his age in rooms in other countries, and he had given various answers and none of them had been entirely right, because the entirely right answer was the kind of thing that resisted being pinned down with words. But he was sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, and she was 9, and she was asking him directly, and she deserved the best version of it he could offer. That's part of it, he said. The other part is knowing what you're doing it for. She thought about that. You did it for her, she said. Langford, and the other people. Yes. And for me. Yes, he said. Mostly for you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set Gerald aside and leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him the way she had in the ballroom. That's without ceremony, without announcement, just the physical fact of it. And he put his arm around her and they sat like that on the edge of her bed while the backyard got dark outside and the streetlights came on one by one down the block, and nobody said anything, and it was the quietest and most complete moment of the entire day. His phone buzzed on the bedside table. He reached for it. An unknown number. A different one than the morning's flood of media and old contacts. He almost let it go to voicemail, and then something made him answer. Logan Pierce, he said. A short pause. Mr. Pierce, this is Celeste Langford. He was quiet for a second. Maisie had sat back and was looking at him with the particular alert attention of a 9-year-old who recognized a name. Ms. Langford, he said. I got your number from... Honestly, it was slightly more complicated than it should have been, and I'm sorry for calling in the evening. I wanted to reach you before the next round of press coverage drops tomorrow morning. Another pause, shorter. And I wanted to say something that I didn't get to say properly last night. You said thank you, he said. I said the words, she said. I'm not sure I said the thing. She paused, and he heard her breathing, and there was a quality to it. Not distress, but the texture of someone finding their way to something they meant and taking the time to get it right. You got off the floor, she said. After everything, after they made you put the gun down, after the threat about Maisie, you lay back down on that floor and stayed completely still, and I thought that was it. I thought you were done. And then you weren't. She stopped. What you did in that room was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen anyone do. And you did it for a room full of strangers. Logan looked at the window, at the dark backyard and the lit-up street beyond. They weren't strangers, he said. They were people in a room. She was quiet for a moment. I think that might be the whole difference, she said quietly, between you and most people. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. I'm not going to keep you, she said. I just wanted you to hear it. A brief pause. How's your jaw? He almost laughed. It came up on him suddenly, not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so precisely the right question to ask, and so far from the register of the conversation that the gap between the two was its own kind of humor. It's been better, he said. I imagine, she said. And there was something in her voice that matched the almost laugh in his chest, a warmth that was unperformed and unplanned. Good night, Mr. Pierce. Good night, he said, He put the phone down. Maisie was looking at him. Was that her? She said. Yeah. What did she want? He thought about how to say it. To make sure I knew something, he said. Maisie considered this. Did you know it already? He looked at his daughter. At the room that he'd painted twice since they moved in, the shelf with her books, the drawings above the bed, the elephant on the blanket, the whole accumulated ordinary evidence of a life built carefully and slowly from what had been left after the hard things. No, he said. Not entirely. She seemed satisfied with that, in the way she was satisfied with answers that were incomplete but honest. She picked Gerald back up. She opened her book. Logan sat for another minute on the edge of her bed, and then he got up and went downstairs and stood in the kitchen and looked at the 4 coffee cups still in the dish rack from the afternoon, and he thought about what Celeste Langford had said, and about Maisie's question on the floor of the ballroom, and about the particular quality of a room when 240 people discover simultaneously that the danger has passed. He thought about all of it for a while. Then he washed the cups and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and this time he slept. The press coverage broke fully on Wednesday morning, the way press coverage broke when the story had everything the cycle wanted. A dramatic hostage situation, a billionaire tech CEO, a former Navy SEAL who'd been hiding in plain sight among the catering tables, and the visual irony of a man in a rented tuxedo dismantling a professional mercenary operation with his hands. Logan read none of it. He knew it was there. Danny sent 3 texts before 8 in the morning with links he didn't open, and when he drove Maisie to school, the radio was doing a segment on it that he turned off after 45 seconds. He dropped her at the curb in front of the school entrance, and she gathered her backpack and opened the door, and then stopped with one foot on the curb and turned back. People might ask me about it today, she said. They might, he agreed. What do I say? He thought about it. Whatever's true, he said. You don't have to say more than that. She looked at him with the evaluating expression she'd been deploying since she was approximately 4 years old. What if they ask if you're a hero? Tell them your dad fixes HVAC units and has terrible taste in action movies. She almost smiled. Almost. Both of those things are true, she said. I know, he said. She got out of the car. He watched her go through the entrance doors, backpack over one shoulder, hair still pursuing its ambition toward waist length, and then he pulled away from the curb and went to his first job of the day, which was a commercial building on the east side of the city with a rooftop ventilation system that had been running hot for 3 weeks and whose building manager had reached the particular pitch of agitation that meant the next call would be a formal complaint. He spent 4 hours on that roof. The problem turned out to be a damper failure compounded by a filter that hadn't been changed since the previous administration of the building's maintenance contract, which was a thing that happened more than it should and never surprised him anymore. He fixed the damper, replaced the filter, ran a diagnostic on the secondary units, and billed 2 hours of labor and parts. The building manager came up to the roof at one point and stood near the access door watching him work with the specific expression of someone who had been expecting to have an argument and had not been given the opportunity. I've been trying to reach your company for a week, the man said. My office line had some issues, Logan said, which was true. He'd been ignoring it since Wednesday morning. It's sorted now. You're the one from the news, the man said. It wasn't entirely a question. Logan tightened a connector fitting and didn't look up. Ventilation system's going to run clean now. I'd recommend a quarterly filter check going forward. I can set up a service schedule if you want. The building manager was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, sure, set it up. He drove home at 2 in the afternoon, stopped at the grocery store, stood in the cereal aisle for 4 minutes, deciding between 2 options that Maisie had specifically not expressed a preference about, and chose the one with more protein and less food coloring. The checkout clerk, a young woman, college-aged, looked at his jaw, which was deep purple now, and impressive in the way that bruises became impressive on the second day, and then looked at his face, and he watched recognition move across her expression. Oh, she said. Do you have bags? He said. Or should I use mine? She blinked. Yes, we have bags. I'll use mine, he said. He drove home. He put the groceries away. He picked Maisie up at 3:15. She got in the car and put on her seatbelt and said, without preamble, 7 people asked me about it. What did you tell them? What's true, she said, that you were there and there was a situation and you helped. That's good. Tyler Marsh asked if you were going to be on TV. No. I told him probably not. He seemed disappointed. She paused. Mrs. Okonkwo asked about you too. My teacher. What did she ask? If you were okay. Maisie looked out the window. I said yes. Are you? He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yeah, he said. I am. She nodded. Apparently satisfied, she pulled out a library book and began reading, and they drove the rest of the way home in the specific comfortable silence that was one of the things Logan was most grateful for about his daughter. Her ability to ask the things she needed to ask and then let it go when she had the answer. Thursday passed without incident. Friday was quieter. The news cycle moved on with the velocity that news cycles moved at now. Something else arrived to occupy the space. Some other story with its own urgent geometry, and the Harrington Grand Hotel incident receded from the front of things without disappearing entirely. There were longer pieces being written, Logan knew, in magazines and online outlets that worked on slower timelines. He didn't read those either. What he did do, on Friday evening, was call the number that had appeared at the bottom of the official statement Celeste Langford's communications team had released, the one that included a direct line for media inquiries. He didn't call the media line. He called the number below it, which was a general contact for the Langford Foundation, and which, after 2 transfers and a brief hold, connected him to an assistant named Marcus, who had a very professional phone voice, and who told him that Miss Langford had left instructions that Mr. Pierce's calls should be put through. He had not expected that. Mr. Pierce? Her voice was different on the phone than it had been in person. Cleaner, less atmospheric, more like a tool being used with precision. I didn't expect to hear from you. I wanted to follow up on something, he said. The federal task force. They spoke to me again on Thursday, second interview. They asked some questions about Volcon's operational communication patterns that I want to make sure were passed to your security team. A brief pause. My security director is coordinating directly with the task force. Good. There was something specific, the way Volcon ran the phone sweep operation, the timing and the signal jamming radius. It has an overlap with a technique pattern that showed up in 2 previous operations that the task force mentioned. If your security director hasn't already cross-referenced the jamming frequency specs, they should. There was a silence on the line that had a different quality than a conversational pause. It was the silence of someone writing something down, or at minimum holding information with enough care to give it the weight it deserved. I'll make sure he gets that, she said. That's why you called? Mostly. Another pause, smaller. What's the other part? He looked at the kitchen table. He had a mug of coffee going cold at his elbow and a stack of invoices he'd been processing and a drawing Maisie had left there. An elaborate rendering of what appeared to be a castle with a moat, populated by animals he couldn't entirely identify. I wanted to know how you were doing, he said. Actually, not the statement version. The silence this time was different again. It had the quality of surprise. Not dramatic, but real. The kind of surprise people felt when someone asked a question they hadn't prepared an answer to. Honestly, she said, if you want. I haven't slept well, she said. There are moments in the day where I'm doing something completely ordinary and then I'm back in the room. It's not, I'm functional, I'm working, but the ordinary things feel strange in a way they didn't before. That's normal, he said. It'll shift. Takes a few weeks, sometimes longer. From experience? From experience, he said. She exhaled. My security director wants to triple the protection detail. My board wants me to take 2 weeks off. My communications team has 700 media requests and counting. She paused. Everybody has an opinion about what I should do next. What do you want to do? A short laugh. Genuine, a little rueful. I want to go back to my office and do my actual job. I've got 3 product launches in the pipeline and a board meeting in 6 weeks and a partnership negotiation that's been stalled for 2 months that I need to personally unblock. She paused. And I want to not feel like the walls are moving when I'm standing in them. The first part's easier than the second, he said. I figured. She was quiet for a moment. How did you do it? After After whatever things you went through, how did you go back to ordinary? He thought about this. It was a question that deserved honesty more than comfort. Badly, at first, he said. I thought moving forward was about not looking back at the hard things. What I eventually figured out was that it was more about learning where to put them, finding places in your life where the hard things could sit without taking up all the space. She was quiet. They don't go away, he said. The moments in the day where you're suddenly back in the room, that keeps happening for a while. You just get better at recognizing it for what it is, which is your mind doing a normal thing in response to an abnormal event. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It means you were actually there. That's the strangest comfort, she said, that I've heard in 4 days. You can get a different one somewhere if you want. No, she said. I'll keep this one. Another pause, and he could hear her chair moving, the small sounds of a person repositioning in a space. I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me if it's too much. Go ahead. There's an initiative I've been developing, the foundation side of things, separate from the company, a veterans transition program, the kind of thing that connects former service members with career development resources, educational funding, mentorship in professional industries. It's been in planning for about 2 years, and it keeps getting deprioritized in favor of the company's operational needs. She stopped. After Tuesday night, I've been thinking about it differently, about what it actually means and what it deserves. Logan said nothing. He was listening. I want to launch it properly, she said, funded, staffed, with a structure that can sustain itself. And I want to build it with input from people who have actually been through the transition, not just program administrators who've read papers about it. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone who had thought through what they were about to say and was not offering it lightly. I'd like your input, not ceremonially, not as a name on a letterhead. Actually, your experience, your perspective on what the transition is like and what it needs. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the backyard was dark, the tire swing a shadow, the bird feeder he kept meaning to refill still empty. I'm a maintenance contractor, he said. I know what you are, she said. I know what you were, and I know what you chose, and both of those things are exactly why I'm asking. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Maisie's drawing on the table, the castle with its complicated moat, the unidentifiable animals populating the landscape with the confident specificity that children brought to imagined worlds. Let me think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. Take the time. He did. He took 9 days, which was longer than was probably strictly necessary, but was the amount of time it took him to work through the specific thing he needed to work through, which was not whether the program was worth doing. It clearly was. And not whether his perspective would be useful. He had enough self-knowledge to believe it might be. But whether accepting this was a thing he could do without it changing the shape of the life he'd built, the life that was sized and structured precisely around the thing that mattered most to him, which was being available to his daughter in the specific and particular way that she needed. He thought about that. He turned it over. He talked to Danny about it in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes and included Danny saying, at least twice, Logan, man, this is a good thing. Just say yes. And Logan explaining that it wasn't about whether it was good, and Danny saying he understood while clearly not entirely understanding, and Logan eventually saying he needed to go and hanging up. He talked to Maisie about it. Not fully. She was 9, and the full version was more complexity than was fair to put on a 9-year-old. But he told her that the woman from Tuesday night had asked him to help with a project, and that the project was about helping veterans when they came home from service, and that it would take some of his time, and he wanted to know what she thought. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was actually thinking rather than formulating a response. Would it make things harder, she said, like less time for stuff? Some, he said. Not a lot. I'd make sure of that. Would it be good for them, the veterans? I think so. That's what I try to make sure of. She thought about this. Then you should do it, she said, with the particular confidence of a 9-year-old who had reached a conclusion and saw no reason to hedge it. You're good at things that need doing. He looked at her. Where did you get that from? She shrugged, the elaborate shrug of a child avoiding attribution. I just know it, she said, and went back to her book. He called Celeste back on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the gala. Maisie was in the backyard doing something involving a cardboard box, some string, and ambitions she had not fully disclosed. "I'll do it," he said, "with some conditions." "What conditions?" "It needs to be built around what the transition actually looks like, not around what programs think the transition looks like. That means the people you're serving need to be in the room when the structure gets designed, not brought in after the structure is done to validate decisions already made." "Agreed," she said without hesitation, which told him she'd thought about this already and had arrived in the same place. "And it needs to be built to run without me," he said, "long term. I'm not interested in being the face of something. I'm interested in helping build something that works after I'm not in it." "That's the right way to build anything," she said. "I'm glad you said it first." He looked out the kitchen window. Maisie had gotten the cardboard box onto the tire swing somehow and appeared to be testing a theory about load-bearing capacity. "One more thing," he said. "Yes?" "The children's education component. In the outline you sent over..." She had sent an outline, a 7-page document that had arrived in his inbox 3 days after their call, and which he had read 4 times. "The funding model for that piece is underdeveloped. If veterans' kids lose ground during the transition period, educationally, emotionally, developmentally, that doesn't get fixed just by stabilizing the parent's situation. It needs its own track." A pause. "You sound like you know that from a specific place." "I do," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Expand that section," she said. "Write me something, whatever you think it needs." "I'm not a policy writer." "You've been making me recalibrate every assumption I had about this program in the last 30 seconds, she said. "You'll manage." He wrote 3 pages over the following week. It was the hardest thing he'd written in years. Harder than the federal statement, harder than the insurance paperwork he'd filed when Sarah died, because it required him to look directly at the thing he had been navigating for 6 years, the specific shape of raising a child alone after loss, the gaps that institutions didn't cover and communities couldn't always fill, the way a child could be fine and also quietly carrying something that no one was formally equipped to help them with, and to write it in language clear enough to be useful to people who hadn't lived it. He wrote it on the kitchen table. He wrote parts of it late at night after Maisie was asleep, and parts of it early in the morning before she came down. He left it on the table one evening and went to check the backyard for a sound that turned out to be nothing. And when he came back inside, Maisie was standing at the table reading the first page. She looked up when he came in. "Is this about me?" she said. "Some of it," he said, "and about kids like you." She read another sentence. "You said I was resilient," she said. "You are. You also said," she scanned the page, "that resilience in children shouldn't be mistaken for absence of need." She looked up. "What does that mean?" He sat down across from her. "It means that when a kid handles hard things well, it's easy for adults to assume the kid is fine and move on. But handling things well and not needing support are different." She looked at the page again, then at him. "Were you doing that? Assuming I was fine?" He held her gaze. "Sometimes," he said, "I've been trying to do better." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the page down and pushed it back toward him and said, "It's good. You should send it." She picked up her glass of water and went back upstairs, and he sat with the 3 pages in front of him and felt, in the way that parenting occasionally ambushed him, the weight of the specific privilege and responsibility of being someone's primary world, and the specific terrifying grace of a child who handed that weight back to you plainly and without drama. He sent the document to Celeste the next morning. She called that afternoon. "I read it 3 times, she said. "It's rough." "It's honest," she said. "Rough and honest is what this needs. Give me a week." She paused. "Also, there's something I want to run by you, in person, if that works. It's not about the program. It's about something else, and I want to see your face when I say it." "My face?" "You're harder to read than most people," she said. "But in person, I've got a better chance." He agreed to meet her that Thursday. She came to his neighborhood rather than suggesting a downtown office or restaurant, which he appreciated without saying so. She'd figured out, or intuited, that asking him to come to her world when she could come to his was the right call. They met at a coffee shop on Arden Street that Logan went to twice a week, and where the woman behind the counter knew his order and had never once tried to write his name on a cup. He arrived first. He took a table near the window, facing the door. She came in 6 minutes later in jeans and a dark jacket, no security detail that he could see, though he suspected there was someone in a car somewhere nearby. She was smarter than to go unprotected 2 weeks after Tuesday night, and she got a coffee at the counter and came to the table and sat down across from him. She looked better than she had at the hotel, not fully rested, but closer to it. The particular fragility of the immediate aftermath was gone, replaced by something more like the quality he'd clocked across the ballroom on the night of the gala. The focused, slightly compressed energy of a person who was running fast on multiple tracks simultaneously and had learned to carry it. "Your jaw healed," she said. "Mostly," he said. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I want to tell you something I haven't said publicly," she said. "The task force update. They've identified the client." He went still. "It was a competitor," she said. "Not in the direct technology space, but a financial interest group with stakes in the existing infrastructure contracts that the vulnerability mapping would have disrupted. If that data had hit the market or gone to the right buyer, it would have devalued about $300 million in infrastructure security contracts held by companies in this group's portfolio." She looked at him. "They commissioned Vulcan. They'd been planning it for 4 months. The gala was the access opportunity they'd been waiting for, a public event with me in attendance, predictable, with a known schedule. Have they been charged? Investigations are active in 2 jurisdictions, federal and international. It'll be slow." She looked at her coffee. "My legal team has been on it around the clock. My board wanted me to pursue civil action simultaneously, but I want to let the criminal process work first. Civil suits before a criminal conviction can muddy water that needs to stay clean." "That's right," he said. "I know." A pause. "The vulnerability mapping data is now in a different security architecture. It took my team 6 days to rebuild the access protocols from scratch, but it's done. That door doesn't exist anymore." She looked up at him. "I want you to know that. The thing they came for, it's protected. Nobody else is going to be able to do what they tried to do." He nodded. She held his gaze. "You asked me how I was doing, actually, so I'm telling you actually." "I appreciate that," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression shifted into the different register, the one he'd seen twice before. The one that was not the CEO or the public figure, but simply the person, the 30-year-old woman who had been standing on a stage with a gun pointed at her and had not looked away from it. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Go ahead." "Maisie." She said the name carefully, like something she'd given thought to before using. "You said she's had a rough few years in what you wrote. The loss, the adjustment. I've been thinking about what you wrote, the part about how easy it is to mistake resilience for the absence of need." She stopped. Is she okay? Actually?" He looked out the window. A man walked by with a dog that was trying very hard to get somewhere the man wasn't planning to go. Down the block, a delivery truck was navigating a turn with excessive optimism. "She's better than I give her credit for," he said, "and she needs more than I always remember to give. Both are true." He looked back at Celeste. "She told me to send you that document, the 3 pages. Something moved through Celeste's expression. "She read it?" "She read the first page and told me it was good and to send it." Celeste was quiet for a moment, and he watched her turn that over. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "She is," he said, "without question." The coffee shop was the ordinary mid-morning version of itself. 2 people on laptops, a woman with a stroller, the specific ambient sound of machines and low conversation. Logan sat with his coffee and looked at the woman across the table, who had been a stranger to him 11 days ago and was not a stranger now, in the way that people were not strangers after they had been through something real together. He did not have a word for what she was. Friend was too casual a word for the weight of it, and colleague was wrong in a different way. And he wasn't sure the right word had been coined for the specific relationship that emerged when 2 people had faced something terrible in the same room and both come out the other side. "The program," he said. "I want to start with the veterans who are 18 to 24 months out. Not the immediate transition, That period is covered, however imperfectly. It's the second phase that tends to drop people. The first year the system pays attention. After that, it mostly assumes you figured it out. She nodded. She had her phone out now, taking notes, which he found he didn't mind. And the children's education track needs to be opt-in, he said. Not automatic, not assumed. Some families want the privacy of handling it without institutional involvement. And building a program that respects that while still making it available it's harder, but it's the only version that works. How do you build opt-in without making people feel like they're asking for charity? She said. You build it so the default framing is access, not assistance, he said. You're not offering help. You're offering a resource that everyone in this community has earned the right to use. Language matters. She wrote something, looked up. I want to put you in the room when we do the first design sessions, she said. Not as an advisor from a distance. In the room. I know, he said. That's why I said yes. They talked for another hour and 20 minutes, until Logan's phone buzzed with a reminder he'd set for a 2 o'clock job. A residential client in the south of the city with a baseboard heating issue that had been escalating in urgency inversely with the dropping temperature. He showed it to her, which made her smile. Go fix someone's heat, she said. I will, he said. He stood to leave. She stood too, and for a moment they were both standing beside the small table in the coffee shop on Arden Street, and outside the window the city moved at its own pace, indifferent and continuous. Thank you, she said. Again, for all of it. You can stop thanking me, he said. I'll stop when it stops being warranted, she said, which hasn't happened yet. He looked at her. She looked back. He thought about the first time he'd seen her across the ballroom. The woman in the green dress who was running her end of a conversation she was only partly in. The person who knew exactly what she was worth and had spent years watching people mistake the price tag for the whole inventory. He thought about what it had taken for her to stand up when her name was called, in the dark, in front of 240 people with nowhere to go. He thought about the fact that she had not broken, not once, in the entire time he'd been watching, even when the math had been worst. He didn't say any of this. It would have come out wrong. Some things were true in the body and didn't improve with translation. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, she said. Tell Maisie hi. He drove to the south side and fixed the baseboard heating, which turned out to be a zone valve failure with a secondary bleed issue that he resolved in 90 minutes. The client was an older man named Arthur, who offered him tea twice and declined to mention anything about the news and asked detailed questions about how zone valves worked, which Logan answered fully while he worked, because Arthur was genuinely curious, and genuine curiosity was one of the things Logan had never found a reason to hurry past. He drove home in the late afternoon light, the city doing what it did in late October, the trees working through their annual audit of what to keep and what to let go. He thought about what Maisie had said. You're good at things that need doing. He thought about what it had taken him to hear that. Not the words. The words were simple. But the thing behind the words, the specific thing that a 9-year-old offered without conditions and without expectation of return, the thing that was simply her reading of him, uncomplicated by what anyone else thought or what the magazine said or what the news cycle had decided he was this week. He had spent 6 years being someone's father and a maintenance contractor and a man who lived quietly in a house on a street where nobody knew what he'd been. And he had built that life with deliberate care because he'd understood, in the particular way that loss teaches understanding, that the ordinary things were not the consolation prizes of a life that had been aimed at something larger. They were the thing. The bird feeder and the tire swing and the patent leather shoes and the stuffed elephant named Gerald and the homework and the grocery store debates over cereal, all of it was the thing, the actual irreducible substance of a life worth living, and none of it required him to be anyone other than who he had chosen to become. But who he had been was also real. That was the part he'd been quieter about. Not with Maisie. She knew pieces of it in the way children knew pieces of things, assembled from what they observed and what they were told, and the gaps between the two that they filled in with their own best guesses. But with himself. He'd been quiet about the fact that the training didn't retire when the man did, that the skills were still there, sharp as they'd ever been, maintained by a body that didn't know how to forget, and a mind that had been built to run a certain way. He'd been quiet about the specific loneliness of being the only person in any given room who was counting the exits and tracking the movement patterns and running the math. Not because he wanted to, but because the off switch had never been installed. Tuesday night had not changed him. That was the thing he wanted to be clear about, at least to himself. He was not a different man after it. He had not rediscovered some buried version of himself or unlocked a chapter that had been closed. He was the same man who drove a dented truck and fixed HVAC units and made eggs on weekday mornings. What had changed was smaller and more precise than that. It was something about the relationship between the two versions, the father and the soldier, which he'd been treating for years as a succession, a before and after, the second one replacing the first. Tuesday had shown him something he might have known earlier if he'd been less committed to the replacement narrative. The two things were not a before and after. They were a both and. He was both things. He could be both things. And the second thing, the father, the ordinary man, the person who knew where the cereal was and which library book Maisie was on, and that Gerald needed to be on the bed before she could sleep, that was not less than the first. It was not the remnant of a life that had been aimed somewhere grander and missed. It was the destination. It was what all of it had been for, the training and the deployments and the hard years and the choice to come home and stay home. It was the destination all along, and he had been living in it for 6 years without fully understanding that he'd arrived. He pulled into his driveway. The house was quiet, warm lit from the inside. Maisie was home. He could see the light in her room, the shadow of her moving past the window. In the backyard, the cardboard box that had been involved in Tuesday's tire swing experiment was still there, slightly rain-damaged, but apparently not abandoned. He sat in the truck for a moment. He thought about what it would look like, the thing he was building with Celeste, the program that would take 2 years to stand up properly and would fail in some of its first versions and would need to be rebuilt in ways neither of them had anticipated, and would eventually, if they did it right, be a thing that worked, not because they were exceptional people, but because they had built it around the actual texture of the problem rather than the version of the problem that was easier to solve. He thought about the veterans who would come through it at 18 months out, when the system had stopped paying attention, when the ordinary life was supposed to have taken over, but sometimes hadn't fully taken hold yet. He thought about their children. He thought about Maisie, 9 years old, behind a chair with a gold back in a darkened ballroom, holding herself together in the dark because her father had asked her to wait, and she had trusted him enough to wait. He thought about the drawing on the kitchen table, the castle with its moat and its confident animals. He thought about the question she'd asked him on the way home from school. "Are you okay?" Actually, he got out of the truck. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. He put down his bag. He started water for pasta because it was a Thursday, and Thursday was usually pasta, a pattern so established that it had stopped requiring a decision. Maisie came downstairs when she heard him. She leaned against the kitchen door frame with her hair down and her school clothes still on, and an expression of terminal casualness that didn't quite conceal that she'd been listening for him. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. "How was school?" "Okay. We did a thing in science about pressure systems. It was actually interesting." "Yeah?" "Yeah, the way pressure moves, like how high pressure pushes into low pressure areas. Ms. Okonkwo said weather is basically just the atmosphere trying to fix imbalances." She paused. "I thought about you when she said that." He looked at her. "Why?" She shrugged with the studied nonchalance of a 9-year-old who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it directly. "Because you go where the problems are," she said. "I think that's just what you do." He looked at his daughter in the kitchen doorway, in the warm, ordinary light of a Thursday evening, with the water beginning to heat on the stove and the backyard dark outside the window and the tire swing just visible. And he did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying, because she had said the thing with the precision that she occasionally and accidentally achieved, the precision of someone who saw clearly because they had not yet learned all the reasons to look away. He went where the problems were. He had always gone where the problems were. And then he came home. That was the whole of it, really. Not a hero's story with a clean arc and a medal at the end. Not a tragedy. Not a triumph. Just a man who had particular skills and a particular love, and the particular stubbornness required to hold both at once. To refuse the story that said they were opposites. To insist by action rather than declaration that a person could be a warrior and a father, a protector and a homemaker. A man who knew every exit in every room, and also a man who knew which stuffed animal had to be on the bed before a 9-year-old could sleep. Both things. Always both. "Come set the table," he said. She pushed off the door frame and came into the kitchen and got the plates from the cabinet with the confidence of someone who had done this task several thousand times and had no remaining uncertainty about it. She set the table, 2 places, the way it always was, the way it had always been, and she did it without ceremony or performance, just the simple practical act of making space for the 2 of them in the house that was theirs. Logan Pierce stirred the water and waited for it to boil and listened to his daughter moving around the kitchen behind him, and outside the window the night settled in over the city, over the ordinary streets and the ordinary houses, over the places where people were fixing things and building things and making dinner and putting children to bed, and none of it was extraordinary, and all of it was, and that was the exact and entire truth of it. The water boiled. He put in the pasta and set the timer and turned around. "Okay," he said. "Tell me about the pressure systems." And she did.